Hey there, welcome to Broderos. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. I sat down by the window, watching the night unfold outside. The train rattled and hummed along the tracks, its steady motion lulling me into a strange sense of calm. The soft glow from the dimly lit overhead lights created a haze of yellow, making the compartment feel both too close and too distant at the same time. It was late, very late. The kind of time when the world feels empty and the silence around you becomes its own noise. I had taken this train for years, the same route, the same stations, the same time. There was comfort in the routine, in the familiarity. But tonight felt different. Something in the air was off, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. The passengers around me were scattered, but the atmosphere felt heavy. No one spoke, save for a few whispers exchanged between a couple of people near the doors. It wasn't unusual for people to keep to themselves on the late-night train, but there was something in the way they moved, in the way they spoke quietly, that made my skin crawl. They weren't just tired travelers, they seemed on edge. The kind of edge you feel before something bad happens. I shifted uncomfortably in my seat. A faint tapping sound came from the row behind me, the rhythmic, repetitive noise of someone's fingers drumming against the metal armrest. I turned to glance at the person, but they were staring straight ahead, not at me, not at anything in particular. Their eyes were wide, almost vacant. I quickly turned back to the window, unwilling to let my gaze linger any longer. A chill ran through me. Then, from somewhere to my left, I heard a voice. Quiet, soft, but clear. You shouldn't have come in here. My body froze. I looked around, trying to locate the source of the voice. It didn't come from anyone nearby, but it had been unmistakable, directed at me. I caught the eyes of one of the passengers seated across the aisle. He was staring at me now, his face partially illuminated by the flickering light above. His expression was strange, unreadable, like he knew something I didn't. "Excuse me?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. He didn't respond, but his lips twitched, almost in a smile, before he turned his gaze away. My heart began to race. What was happening? Why did it feel like I was being watched by every pair of eyes in the compartment? I looked around again, noticing now how the others had subtly shifted their positions, angling themselves so they could see me without being too obvious. The whispers grew louder, their words too soft for me to catch. But the fear in their tone, the tension in the air, was palpable. The train passed through a tunnel, and the lights flickered for a moment. When they came back on, the atmosphere had shifted, as if the very air had become thicker, harder to breathe. My fingers gripped the armrest, my nails digging into the cold metal. I tried to shake the feeling, tried to tell myself it was just the late hour, the fatigue playing tricks on my mind. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The sound of the train's wheels on the tracks became louder, faster, almost as though we were moving too quickly, faster than the rails could carry us. The air seemed to vibrate with a low hum. Then the tapping started again. This time, it was different. It wasn't just a sound, it was a presence. The tapping was too steady, too deliberate. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was behind me was moving closer. I tried to look back again, but my head was filled with a strange heaviness, as though something was pulling me away from the truth, pulling me deeper into the mystery. I focused on the window, trying to calm my nerves by watching the blurred images of the passing landscape, but even the night outside seemed to be changing. The darkness pressed in on the glass, darker than I had ever seen. Suddenly, the tapping stopped. For a moment, I thought I could hear something else, something much fainter, like soft, slow breathing. It wasn't coming from anyone near me, but from somewhere further in the train, deeper into the darkness beyond the compartment. I turned again to the passenger across the aisle. He was staring at me again, his gaze colder now, more intense. This time, he didn't smile. "You shouldn't have come in here," he said again, and his voice wasn't a whisper anymore. It was a low growl, a command. "You're not supposed to be on this train." The words hung in the air like a thick fog, suffocating me. My heart began to race uncontrollably. What was going on? What was he talking about? Was this some kind of sick joke? I felt my chest tighten, and the world around me seemed to grow more distant. I tried to look away, but the pressure in the air, the strange hum, the oppressive silence, it was all too much. I had to get off. I had to leave this train. But somehow, I didn't think it would let me. The train jolted, throwing me forward slightly. I caught myself on the seat in front of me, my heart still pounding, a wave of panic washing over me. The world outside the window had disappeared into an impenetrable dark, as if the night itself had swallowed the train whole. I could barely make out the shapes of the trees blurring past in the distance. I glanced nervously toward the door. I couldn't see anyone else moving, but I could feel the weight of their eyes on me, like 1,000 invisible hands pressing down on my shoulders. I tried to steady my breath, but the words of the man, "You're not supposed to be on this train," echoed in my mind, refusing to fade. What did he mean? How could I not be supposed to be here? This was just a late-night train, just like any other I had taken before. But something was different now, something I couldn't understand. It was as though the world had shifted when I stepped onto this train, and I had missed the change. The rhythmic hum of the train's wheels on the tracks had become unnervingly loud, almost like a warning. The lights flickered again, this time more aggressively. For a brief moment, the train plunged into total darkness, the kind that presses against your skin and fills your ears with silence so thick it feels suffocating. I held my breath, waiting for the train to return to light, my eyes wide and desperate for something, anything, to give me a sense of safety. When the lights finally came back, they were dimmer, the once comforting yellow glow now a sickly, pale green. My hands gripped the armrest harder, nails digging into the fabric. I turned my head slowly to the left, my breath shallow. The man who had spoken to me earlier was no longer across the aisle. I couldn't see him anywhere, but I could still feel his eyes, watching me from somewhere within the train. The passengers around me had shifted once more. The man who had been sitting in the row behind me was now standing near the door at the far end of the compartment, his face obscured by the shadows, but his posture unmistakable. There was something about him that seemed wrong, unnatural, even. He wasn't standing like a tired traveler, waiting to get off at the next stop. He stood too still, too rigid, like a statue. I looked away quickly, the fear clawing at my insides. Then, a sound. A faint tapping again, but this time it was much closer. It came from behind me, slow and deliberate. I didn't dare turn around, but I could feel it, hear it, right at the back of my neck. The sound was building, getting closer, like someone was walking behind me, their footsteps muffled against the train's carpeting. But there was no one there. I blinked, trying to shake off the dizziness that had settled over me. I looked back toward the door, hoping for something familiar, anything that would make sense of this madness. The train rattled as it sped through the dark countryside, the lights flickering once again before stabilizing. And then, as if in response to my silent plea, a voice, soft but clear, drifted through the air. "You're not alone." I froze. I didn't know where it came from. The words weren't directed at me, but they felt like they were. A chill ran down my spine. It wasn't the first time I had heard something like this. It was like the voices, the whispers, were traveling through the walls of the train, circling me, surrounding me. I turned quickly to look at the other passengers, but no one was speaking, no one was moving. Everyone was still, and their eyes that seemed to glisten with something darker than sleep, were all fixed on me. That's when I noticed it. The air had changed again. It wasn't the normal train air anymore, filled with the faint smell of dust and old upholstery. It had a thickness to it, a strange weight. The scent of something metallic was in the air, and I could taste it on my tongue. It wasn't blood, but it was something close. A low, soft moan echoed from somewhere deeper within the train, followed by a groan, a creak that wasn't the normal sound of the train's movement. It was different, unnatural. And then the temperature dropped. I glanced at the windows. The frost was forming along the edges, creeping in from the corners like a slow-moving disease. My breath, now visible in the cold air, formed clouds in front of my face. I could feel the cold pressing in from all sides, but it wasn't just the air. It was the presence of something else, something I couldn't see but could feel. It was like a weight pressing on my chest, making it hard to breathe. I didn't want to look back, but the tapping had returned, louder now, unmistakably behind me. And then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it. The shadow. The one that shouldn't have been there. It was moving, but not like a normal shadow. It didn't shift in the way light would cast it. It seemed to slither, to twist as if it were alive, its edges fuzzy and indistinct. My breath hitched. The cold, the whispers, the shadows, all of it was happening at once. I had to leave. I had to get off this train, but I didn't know how. The doors were too far, and I didn't trust the hallways beyond. The tapping stopped. The air was still. And then another voice came, this time directly into my ear, cold and sharp. "You're next." I wanted to scream, to jump from my seat, but I couldn't move. My body was frozen, my mind fighting against the overwhelming sense of dread that had settled in my bones. I didn't know what was going to happen, but I knew one thing for certain: I was no longer just a passenger on this train. I was part of something else now. The air in the compartment felt thicker now, pressing down on me, suffocating me. I tried to move, tried to stand, but my limbs felt heavy, as though they were made of stone. My eyes darted around the train, searching for some way out, but the walls seemed to close in with each passing second. The faint tapping returned, but it wasn't coming from behind me this time. It was all around me, echoing off the walls, reverberating through the floorboards. My heart pounded in my chest. My palms were slick with sweat, but the cold never left, the icy chill that had seeped into my bones. The passengers hadn't moved. They were still, their eyes locked on me, unmoving, unblinking. Their faces were gaunt, hollow, like they hadn't slept in days. Or maybe they hadn't eaten. I couldn't tell. The train's motion had slowed, but the sensation of moving forward, relentlessly moving forward, never stopped. It felt as though we were speeding through an endless void, an abyss, where there was no end in sight. The whispers grew louder. They were soft at first, just murmurs beneath the humming of the train, but now they were sharp, piercing the air like 1,000 sharp needles. I tried to block them out, but they seeped into my ears, crawling inside my mind, filling every empty space. Each whisper seemed to speak directly to me, telling me things I couldn't understand, things I didn't want to know. Get off. Get off. The voice was clear this time, harsh, desperate. It wasn't a whisper anymore. It was a command. I turned toward the door, my body trembling, my breath coming in short gasps. I had to leave. I had to get away from these people, from this place. But when I reached for the door handle, it didn't budge. It was locked, and no matter how hard I twisted it, it wouldn't open. Another voice, this time coming from the seat beside me. You can't leave. Not yet. I whipped my head around, eyes wide with terror. The man who had been sitting across the aisle was now right next to me, his face just inches from mine. His eyes were wide, pupils dilated, his breath cold against my skin. His lips were moving, but the words were not his own. They were deeper, darker, like something inside him was speaking, something that didn't belong. You shouldn't have come here, the voice whispered. You're trapped now. We're all trapped. I recoiled, my heart hammering in my chest. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The room seemed to spin around me, the walls stretching and contorting, bending inward like the train itself was alive, wrapping itself around me, closing me in. The tapping started again, louder now. Closer. I couldn't take it anymore. I couldn't breathe. I bolted from my seat, desperate to get away from the oppressive air, from the suffocating silence that surrounded me. My footsteps echoed in the narrow aisle, but there was no one to stop me. No one to help. The passengers were still watching, their eyes now glazed over, as if they were no longer alive, but mere vessels for something else. I reached the door, my hand shaking as I tried the handle again. It was cold to the touch, colder than it should have been. And then, as if it had a mind of its own, the door clicked open. I stepped into the hallway, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my heart still racing. The train's dim light barely illuminated the passage, casting long shadows that seemed to reach out for me. The walls were closer here, the space feeling smaller, tighter. I stumbled forward, my mind racing as I tried to find my way through the dark, but every turn seemed to lead me deeper into the labyrinth of the train. I could hear the footsteps behind me now, the slow, deliberate tapping echoing through the narrow hallway. Whoever, or whatever, was following me was closing in. I had to move faster. I had to find the exit. But the further I went, the more disoriented I became. The train was no longer just a means of transport, it was a maze, an endless, twisting nightmare. Another voice, this time from the darkness ahead. You can't escape. You're already part of it. I froze. The voice was so close, I could feel its breath on my neck. Please, leave me alone, I whispered, my voice barely audible over the growing hum of the train. What do you want from me? The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. And then, a laugh. A low, guttural laugh that sent a chill through my bones. You don't understand, the voice said. You're already one of us. The words sent a wave of nausea through me. I backed away, my legs weak, my mind spinning. I could feel the walls closing in on me again, the claustrophobia tightening its grip. I had to keep moving, had to keep running, but where could I go? I turned down another hallway, my eyes darting left and right, searching for something, anything that would make sense. But there was nothing. No windows. No exits. Just endless metal walls that seemed to close in on me with every step. And then, I saw it. At the far end of the hallway, a door, an exit. It was just barely visible, the faintest sliver of light seeping through the cracks around the frame. I ran toward it, faster now, desperate. My breath was ragged, my pulse pounding in my ears. I reached the door. My hand shook as I grabbed the handle, twisting it with all my strength. The door creaked open, and I stepped through. And then, nothing. I stumbled through the door, my legs weak beneath me, my heart still hammering in my chest. I had no idea where I was, but it didn't matter. The train, the passengers, the eerie whispers, they were all behind me now. Or so I thought. I stood in what looked like a small storage room, the walls lined with old luggage and empty crates. It was silent here, the only sound the faint hum of the train's movement that seemed to come from nowhere, filling the space with a low, constant vibration. There were no windows, no exits, just the heavy smell of dust and rust. For a moment, I thought I was safe. But then, I heard it again, the tapping. It was softer now, more subtle, but it was still there, echoing through the quiet space. I turned around, my eyes scanning the room, searching for the source. But there was nothing. No one. Just shadows and the lingering feeling of being watched. I took a step forward, my breath shallow, when I felt something cold brush against my ankle. I froze. My eyes dropped to the floor, and there, in the dim light, I saw it. A shadow, crawling across the floor. A shape, shifting and undulating, too dark to be natural, too fluid to be real. It moved toward me, slow and deliberate, its edges writhing like tendrils of smoke. The tapping had stopped, replaced by a soft, rhythmic scratching sound, as though something sharp was dragging along the floor. I backed away, but the shadow didn't stop. It kept coming, its shape growing larger, the air around it growing colder. It was too much. I couldn't breathe. I turned and ran, my footsteps clattering against the metal floor, my hands scrambling for anything to hold on to. I reached for the door behind me, but it slammed shut before I could grab the handle. The walls seemed to close in on me again, pushing me forward, deeper into the darkness. I kept running, but the hallway stretched on endlessly, an infinite loop of dark, twisting passages that all looked the same. The more I ran, the more disoriented I became. I had no sense of direction, no sense of time. It felt like I was running in circles, trapped in the same place, the same nightmare. The temperature dropped again, the air becoming thick with the metallic scent I had noticed before. The whispers returned, louder now, each one brushing against my skin like cold fingers. They were everywhere, surrounding me, pressing in on all sides. I tried to drown them out, but they kept coming, repeating the same words over and over. You're one of us. You can't leave. You're trapped. I clutched my head in my hands, my nails digging into my scalp as I tried to hold on to my sanity. I couldn't tell if the voices were real or if they were just in my head. All I knew was that I couldn't escape. Then, I heard something that made my blood run cold, a door opening. I turned toward the sound, my eyes wide with panic. A figure stepped into the hallway. It was tall, draped in shadows, its face obscured by the dark. It moved slowly, deliberately, like it was savoring every step. You shouldn't have come here, the figure said, its voice deep and resonant, like a distant thunderclap. I wanted to scream, but no sound escaped my lips. My body was frozen, my legs too weak to run, my mind too overwhelmed to think. The figure took another step forward, and I could feel the air grow heavier, the temperature plunging. "You're not like the others," it continued, its voice like ice, cutting through the silence. "You're different." I took a step back, my mind racing. Different? What did it mean? What was it talking about? The figure tilted its head, as if studying me, its shadowy form shifting with unnatural fluidity. It was like it didn't belong here, like it was made of something that didn't exist in the world I knew. "You'll understand soon enough," it said, a dark smile curling at the edges of its voice. "But first, you'll have to accept your place." I backed away again, my mind screaming at me to run, to get away, but my body wouldn't obey. My limbs felt like they were made of lead, heavy and unresponsive. The figure advanced, its presence suffocating. And then I saw it. The shadow that had been following me, the one I had felt creeping at my ankles earlier, was now at the edge of my vision, growing larger, more defined. It wasn't a shadow anymore. It was a shape, a form, rising up from the floor, its edges sharp and jagged, like a distorted reflection of something that shouldn't exist. It was coming for me. I turned, finally able to move, and bolted down the hallway, my feet pounding against the metal floor, the whispers growing louder, the shadow rising in pursuit. I didn't know where I was going, didn't know if there was an exit, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't let it catch me. I rounded a corner, my breath coming in frantic gasps, when I saw another door. This one was different. The light behind it wasn't the cold, sterile glow of the train. It was warm, inviting, like the light of the world outside. I ran for it, pushing the door open with all my strength. But as I crossed the threshold, I stopped dead in my tracks. The door slammed shut behind me, and for a moment, I was enveloped in complete darkness. My chest tightened as I stood still, trying to steady my breath. I reached out, feeling the cool, smooth surface of the walls around me, trying to make sense of where I had ended up. The warmth of the light that had beckoned me was gone now, replaced by an oppressive silence. I blinked, trying to adjust to the dark, when a faint, flickering light appeared in the distance. It was a soft glow, like the dim light of a street lamp seen through a fog, but it was enough to give me a sense of direction. I began to move toward it, my steps cautious, the echo of my footfalls strangely muffled in the air. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the very floor beneath me was pulling me down, slowing me, holding me in place. The light grew brighter as I neared, revealing what appeared to be a long, narrow corridor. The walls were covered in peeling paint, the floor worn and cracked. It looked like the inside of an old, abandoned building, but something about it felt wrong. This place didn't belong here. It didn't belong to the train. I continued down the hallway, my heart thudding painfully in my chest. The whispers had returned, but now they weren't just voices. They were sensations, sharp pinpricks against my skin, like needles pressing into me from all directions. I was no longer alone. I could feel it. The light at the end of the corridor flickered, and I quickened my pace. My footsteps echoed louder now, and I could feel the temperature drop again, the air thick with a suffocating heaviness that made it hard to breathe. And then, just as I reached the end of the corridor, the light flickered one last time and went out. A darkness deeper than any I had ever known descended, swallowing everything. My vision was gone. I couldn't see. I couldn't move. The air around me felt dense, heavy, like it was pressing in from all sides. The whispers grew louder, but now they weren't just words. They were sounds, guttural growls, like something was in the room with me, moving through the dark. Suddenly, the floor beneath me shifted, and I stumbled, my legs giving way as the ground tilted at an impossible angle. I reached out, my hands grasping for anything to hold onto, but there was nothing, just the slick, cold surface of the walls and the growing sound of something else, something that wasn't human. I fell to my knees, the darkness closing in tighter, wrapping itself around me. My breath came in short gasps, but I couldn't seem to take in enough air. I was drowning in it. And then, a light, bright, blinding, flashed in front of me. It wasn't the soft glow from before. It was pure, searing white, like the sun itself had suddenly appeared in this impossible darkness. I shielded my eyes, my heart racing as the light seemed to grow closer, moving toward me like an oncoming train. And as it drew near, I could see it. A figure, standing in the center of the light. The same figure from before, the one who had whispered to me, the one who had told me I was one of us. Its face was no longer hidden by shadow, and I could see it clearly now. It wasn't human. Its features were distorted, twisted in ways that shouldn't have been possible. Its eyes were black holes, deep and endless, and its skin shimmered with an eerie, unnatural light. "You can't escape," it said, its voice resonating in my skull, making my head throb with a sickening pressure. "This is where you belong now." I shook my head, unable to speak, unable to move. The light had me pinned, like a fly trapped in amber, and I was helpless. The whispers had returned, louder now, more insistent, rising in a crescendo that was unbearable. And then, in an instant, everything went silent. The light vanished. The whispers stopped. I blinked, and for the first time since I boarded the train, I could see clearly. The train. The familiar old seats. The narrow aisles. The windows, now covered in frost. But something was different. The passengers. They were still there, but they weren't the same. Their eyes were empty, lifeless, staring straight ahead. Some of them were smiling, but it wasn't a smile that belonged to a person. It was the kind of smile you see on a mannequin, on something that doesn't breathe. I looked down at my hands. They were pale, almost translucent, and trembling. I could feel the weight of the air around me, heavier than before, but it wasn't the same. It was colder. Thicker. Like I was submerged in something unnatural. I raised my head, and the figure, the one who had been in the light, was standing at the front of the compartment, watching me. It was smiling now, its mouth stretching impossibly wide, a grin that sent a cold shiver through my spine. "Welcome," it said, its voice echoing in my mind. "Welcome to your new home." I looked around at the other passengers, their vacant eyes fixed on me. They weren't human anymore. They were something else. Something trapped, just like me. I understood now. I wasn't just a passenger on this train. I was part of it. Part of them. The train wasn't going anywhere. And neither was I. Have you ever walked into a place that didn't feel quite right, but you couldn't put your finger on why? A place where the air is too still, too thick, as if something's waiting, watching? That's how I felt when I first stepped into the basement of the apartment building. It was an ordinary evening. I had just moved into the building a few days ago, and I was still figuring things out. The building was old, the kind of place where the walls creak and the floors groan beneath your feet. The kind of place where every hallway feels just a little too narrow and the corners too dark. But that was all. Just a bit of character. Or so I thought. The door to the basement was always locked, but I'd seen the landlord open it once, so I knew there was a way to get down. I had a few things in storage, things I hadn't unpacked yet, so I figured it was time to check. Maybe it would help to get a feel for the place, and I wanted to make sure nothing strange was going on down there. I remember that feeling now, the slight chill in the air as I descended the stairs, the quiet that felt almost too quiet. The hallway at the bottom of the stairs was dim, lit only by a single flickering bulb. The basement smelled of dust and old pipes, the kind of smell that gets into your clothes and your skin, the kind that makes you feel like you're surrounded by something forgotten. I glanced around. The basement stretched out in front of me, lined with old, stacked boxes and crates. It looked like a typical basement, nothing special. But then I noticed something strange. There were marks on the floor. At first, I thought it was nothing. Just dirt. Maybe someone had moved something heavy. But as I stepped closer, I saw that the marks were too precise, too deliberate to be an accident. There were dark smudges, like someone had dragged something heavy across the floor. Long lines, starting from one corner of the room and stretching across the floor, stopping in odd places, like they had been interrupted. I took a step forward, unsure of what I was seeing. The marks seemed to lead toward the farthest corner, where the shadows were deepest. The dim light from above barely reached that part of the room, and I had to squint to make out the details. There, in the shadows, was something else, a faint outline in the dust, like someone had been standing there recently. I paused, my breath catching in my throat. It felt like someone had been watching me, waiting for me to notice. I could hear the faint hum of the light overhead, the creaking of the pipes somewhere in the walls, but nothing else. Not a sound. Not a movement. I took another step, my heart beginning to race. I felt like I should leave, that I should go back upstairs and forget about it. But something kept me there. Some quiet, irrational part of me told me to stay, to explore. So, I did. I walked toward the corner, my footsteps echoing too loudly in the quiet. The closer I got, the more the air seemed to thicken, like the space around me was pressing in. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I turned the corner and stopped dead. There was a door, half open, leading into a small, narrow room I hadn't noticed before. The door was old, the wood cracked and splintered. It looked like it hadn't been opened in years. The room beyond was dark, the shadows deep and still. But what caught my attention were the sounds, soft, subtle, but unmistakable. The faint sound of something shifting, scraping against the floor. I couldn't tell where it was coming from or what it was, but it made my skin crawl. I stepped closer, holding my breath, trying to listen. Then, a sudden noise, a sharp crack, like something breaking, came from the other side of the door. My heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, I stood frozen in place, the air heavy around me. I knew I should turn around. I knew I should leave. But before I could move, before I could decide whether or not to step back into the hallway, something happened. The door, which had been only slightly ajar, slammed shut. The sound was deafening, the sharp bang of the wood against the frame echoing through the basement. I jumped, my pulse racing as I stumbled backward, my eyes wide with fear. For a moment, I stood there, listening to the silence that followed. The door was locked now, sealed shut. I could hear nothing but my own breathing, shallow and fast, like I was suffocating. I was alone. I was completely alone in the basement. But somehow, it didn't feel that way. It didn't feel like I was the only one here anymore. The darkness felt thicker now, more oppressive. It wasn't just the basement anymore, it was the entire building. The walls, the floor, the very air around me, it all seemed to close in, to shift. It felt like something was moving just beyond my reach, just beyond the edge of the light. I stood there for what felt like hours, not daring to move. And then, just as I was about to take a step forward, I heard something. A soft, quiet sound, like the rustling of paper, coming from the other side of the room. Something, or someone, was there. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breath. And then, another noise, this time louder, closer. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, like someone walking toward me. The sound grew louder, the steps echoing in the small, empty space. I turned, ready to run, but then I heard the door behind me, softly, click shut. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the building settling. Someone had just locked me in. The door had closed with an unmistakable click, but the sound was too deliberate, too controlled to be an accident. It wasn't the kind of noise you expect from a building settling or the wind knocking against the walls. It was a sound that meant something had been done on purpose. I stood frozen in place, the weight of the silence pressing down on me, my heart hammering in my chest. I turned slowly, my eyes darting toward the door. It was still there, the dark wooden frame, now a barrier between me and the rest of the world. But something was different. The shadows seemed thicker, more tangible now, as if the dark had grown teeth, ready to bite. I reached out, my fingers trembling, but just as my hand grazed the cold metal of the doorknob, I stopped. The air had shifted again, like a quiet breath had been taken just behind me. I spun around, my pulse racing. The basement was still and silent, but I could feel the presence of something there. Something watching me from the darkness. It was as if the walls themselves were alive, leaning in, eager to consume whatever remained of my courage. I took a step back, my shoes scraping against the floor. The basement was small, but it felt much larger now. The shadows stretched unnaturally, as if they were reaching for me, pulling me deeper into the gloom. I forced myself to move. I turned away from the door, my legs heavy as I walked across the room. The scraping sound from earlier was gone, but something else had replaced it, the faintest whisper, as soft as a breath, but unmistakable. It came from the corner. I froze again. The sound was coming from the farthest corner of the basement, just where the dim light barely reached. I couldn't make out the source, but I could feel it. I could feel the pull. I stepped toward it, my breath shallow, my legs unwilling to obey me. The shadows in the corner seemed to move, twisting and folding over each other like they were alive. The whispering grew louder, clearer, though it was still too faint to make out the words. I reached out, stretching my hand into the darkness, trying to find whatever was hiding there. But there was nothing I could touch. The air was thick, and the further I went, the heavier it became, like the basement itself was sucking the life out of me. I was just about to pull back when I felt something cold brush against my fingertips. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't just the air. It was something else. Something that shouldn't be there. I yanked my hand back and stumbled away, my heart racing. The whispering stopped, but the presence lingered, just out of sight, just beyond the edges of my vision. It was there, waiting. And then, the sound came again. The scraping noise. But this time, it was much closer. Closer than before. It was coming from the direction of the door. I spun around, my mind racing, and found that the space between me and the door had grown. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make my chest tighten with panic. The shadows had grown longer, and the flickering bulb overhead seemed to be dimming, struggling to stay alive. The scraping sound grew louder, and then it became clear. It was a dragging sound, like something being pulled across the floor. It was coming from behind the door. I didn't dare move. I stood there, my eyes fixed on the door, my breath quick and shallow. My body felt paralyzed, rooted to the spot. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, thick enough to make my ears ring. The kind of silence that makes your thoughts seem too loud, too intrusive. I took a shaky step toward the door. The metal doorknob felt cold under my fingers. I pressed my ear to the door, straining to hear, but there was nothing now. Nothing except the soft hum of the overhead light, flickering in rhythm with my heartbeat. I pulled away from the door, my hands shaking. Something was happening here, something I didn't understand. The basement was changing, warping around me, and I had to get out. I had to leave. I took a deep breath, steeling myself to turn and head for the stairs. But the moment I moved, I heard it. The unmistakable sound of footsteps, soft but deliberate, coming toward me from the farthest corner of the basement. They weren't my footsteps. I stopped in my tracks, my heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps grew louder, coming closer, until I could hear them in the silence, slow and measured, like someone was walking toward me. But I couldn't see anyone. I turned back to the door, my mind racing for any possible way out. But it was too late. The door, the way I had come in, was no longer an option. It wasn't just the darkness now, it was something else, something far worse. I could feel the weight of it, like it was pressing against me, pulling at me, threatening to crush me in this tiny, suffocating space. The footsteps grew louder, closer. They were right behind me. And then, without warning, the light above me went out. Complete darkness. I could hear nothing. The footsteps, the dragging sound, gone. The air grew thicker, colder. I could barely breathe, the weight of the darkness pressing against me like it was alive. I didn't know what was happening. I didn't know what had followed me into this basement. But I knew one thing. I wasn't alone. The darkness was suffocating. It wrapped around me like a thick, oppressive blanket, making it hard to breathe. I could feel it pressing in from every side, suffocating the air and turning the space around me into something unrecognizable. My pulse pounded in my ears, my breath shallow and erratic as I stood in the pitch black, utterly still. The footsteps had stopped. Or had they? In the dark, every sound seemed to echo louder, the silence itself becoming a presence. My heart raced in my chest, but I couldn't bring myself to move. I didn't know if I was afraid of the footsteps returning or if I was afraid of what might happen if they didn't. I reached out with my hands, blindly feeling my way around me. My fingers brushed against the cold, damp walls, and I clung to them as if the solid surface could ground me, could protect me. But the walls felt different now, like they were shifting beneath my touch, like the basement was somehow alive, responding to my fear. I let out a shaky breath and stumbled forward, trying to find the stairs, to escape. But my feet felt heavy, my steps uncertain. Each footfall seemed to sound too loud, too deliberate in the silence. It felt as though the basement itself was reacting to me, drawing me deeper into its shadows. Then I heard it. A soft whisper. It was low, almost inaudible, but it was there. A voice, or something that sounded like a voice, brushing against my ear. It wasn't clear, not quite human. But there was no mistaking it. It was coming from the dark, from the direction I had just come from. I froze, holding my breath, every muscle in my body tensing in fear. I didn't dare move. The whispering grew louder, clearer, though I still couldn't make out the words. It wasn't like anything I heard before. There was no rhythm to it, no pattern, just a low, undulating hum of sound. I felt it more than I heard it. The way it seemed to crawl under my skin, making my scalp prickle and my stomach turn. I wanted to scream, to run, to escape. But my legs wouldn't move. My body felt paralyzed, as though the very air was pressing down on me, weighing me down. The whispering stopped. Then there was a sound, a soft shuffle of feet, like someone, or something, was moving closer. It was impossible to tell the direction, but it felt like it was coming from all sides. As if the very space around me was shifting, folding in on itself. I finally forced myself to move, pushing through the heavy air. My legs felt like lead, each step taking an eternity as I stumbled through the basement, trying to find my bearings. I could hear my breath now, fast and panicked, mixing with the sound of my own footsteps. And then the sound came again. A loud, sudden bang. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart nearly leaping out of my chest. It was the sound of something heavy hitting the floor, hard. It came from the corner. The farthest, darkest corner of the basement where the whispering had started. I could feel the weight of it, the coldness of it, drawing me in like a magnet. I turned toward the noise, instinctively taking a step back, but my foot hit something. A box, maybe? Something on the floor. I nearly tripped, but I caught myself, my hand shaking as I steadied myself. My eyes were still struggling to adjust to the darkness, but I could just make out the faintest outline of a figure. It was standing there, just at the edge of the shadows. It wasn't human. It was tall, unnaturally tall, and it was standing perfectly still, not moving an inch. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but no, this thing was real. I could feel its presence, like it was absorbing all the space around it, like it was somehow made of the very darkness itself. I tried to make out more details, but the shadows refused to reveal anything. The air seemed to freeze around me, and I could feel my body trembling uncontrollably. Then, without warning, the figure began to move. Slowly, deliberately, it took a step forward. And then another. Each movement was jerky, unnatural, like the figure was somehow struggling to push itself forward. But each step it took seemed to stretch the space between us, like time itself was slowing down. I felt the panic rise within me. This thing wasn't human. It wasn't even alive in the way I understood it. It was something else, something far worse. I turned, my legs finally obeying me as I sprinted toward the stairs. I didn't look back, didn't want to see the thing following me, getting closer, closer with each second. My breath was ragged, my feet barely finding purchase on the stairs as I scrambled upward. I didn't stop. I didn't even glance over my shoulder. The sounds from below, the scraping, the whispering, the footsteps, were growing louder again, closing in, chasing me up the stairs. And just as I reached the top, the door slammed shut. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the building. It was something else, something that had been waiting for me in the darkness, something that had followed me all the way up. I was shaking now, my body still tingling with the feeling of something that wasn't supposed to be there, something that didn't belong. I turned the doorknob and pulled with all my strength, but the door was locked. It wouldn't budge. I could feel it. It was on the other side. My breath came in shallow gasps as I pressed my back against the door, my palms slick with sweat. The room behind me felt too quiet now, the only sound the harsh rhythm of my heart and the faint scrape of my nails against the cold wood of the door. I couldn't think clearly. Every thought I had was drowned in a wash of panic, and my body felt like it was betraying me. My legs trembled, refusing to hold me steady, my arms weak from the tension that had been building in me since I first stepped into this cursed basement. I wanted to scream. I wanted to shout for help, but I knew it was pointless. No one would hear me. I was alone, trapped. The silence in the room pressed down on me, heavier than it had ever been before. The air seemed thick, suffocating. It was like the very walls of this place were alive, responding to my fear, feeding on it. I could feel the weight of something watching me, studying me from the other side of the door. It was no longer just a presence, it was something more. A force. Something ancient, something that had been here long before I ever stepped into this building. The door shook beneath my palms. I jerked back, my heart leaping into my throat. The sound was unmistakable, a low, guttural growl, deep and rumbling, like it was coming from the very bowels of the earth. It was so close. Too close. I took another step back, away from the door, my legs shaking, barely holding me upright. The darkness seemed to grow thicker around me, pulling me in like a vortex. I could feel it, the darkness, swirling at the edges of my vision, ready to consume me. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't stay in this place any longer. My survival instincts kicked in, pushing me to move, to find a way out. But there was no way out. The door was locked, and the basement had become a prison. The thing that had followed me from below was here, now, and I had no idea what it was, what it wanted. The whispering started again, just at the edge of my hearing, faint but insistent. It was like a call, a beckoning from the dark, urging me to come closer, to give in. The words were still too distant, but I could feel the meaning of them. There was something in those whispers, something ancient and powerful. Something that wanted me to approach it, to succumb to it. I gritted my teeth, fighting the urge to listen. The fear was rising again, clawing at my chest, pushing me toward the door. It was too much to bear. My breath was coming too quickly, too raggedly. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the whispers stopped. I stood there, frozen, unsure of what to do next. The basement was silent now, but the tension in the air was suffocating. The only thing I could hear was my own heartbeat, pounding louder than ever in my ears. And then, something cracked. The sound came from the other side of the door, a sharp, unmistakable crack, like something heavy had broken. My pulse skipped a beat. I knew, without a doubt, that it wasn't just the house settling. Something was coming. Something was trying to break through. I backed away further, my mind racing for an escape, for any chance of survival. But there was nothing. The only way out was through that door, and I knew that I wasn't strong enough to fight whatever was on the other side. The crack came again, this time followed by a series of sickening thuds, like something large was dragging itself across the floor. Slowly, relentlessly, getting closer. I turned, my eyes frantically searching for any other way out. But the basement was a dead end. The walls closed in, the shadows growing darker, more oppressive. It was like the whole space had turned against me. And then, in the deepest part of the shadows, I saw it. A figure. Or what could only be called a figure. It wasn't human. Not in any way I could understand. It was tall, impossibly tall, with long, twisted limbs that stretched and contorted in unnatural ways. Its skin, if it could be called skin, was a sickly, translucent gray, like it was stretched too tight over its bones. Its face, if you could call it a face, was just a blur of darkness, no features, no eyes. Just a void. A pit of nothingness that seemed to swallow up the light, the air, everything around it. It took a slow step forward, its long arms hanging limply by its sides. There was no sound from it, no noise at all. Just a presence. The terrible, suffocating presence that filled the room and made every inch of my body scream for escape. But there was no escape. The figure moved closer, its body bending in ways that no human body could. It didn't walk. It glided, as if it was floating just above the ground, its feet never touching the floor. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. I wanted to scream, but no sound would come out. All I could do was stand there, paralyzed, as the figure drew closer. It stopped in front of me, just inches away, its presence so overwhelming that I felt like I was going to implode, like the very air was being sucked out of me. And then it spoke. Not in a voice, not in words, but in my mind. The words were clear, as if they had always been there, waiting for me to hear them. You shouldn't have come here. The whisper echoed inside my skull, reverberating through every fiber of my being. It wasn't just a statement. It was a judgment. A truth. I had made a mistake. I had disturbed something that should never have been disturbed. And now, it was too late. I don't know how long I stood there, locked in that moment, my body completely still, my mind screaming in every direction but unable to move. The figure before me was a thing of nightmare, of something that existed beyond what any human mind should comprehend. It wasn't just a shadow. It was the void itself, the emptiness that consumed everything around it. The coldness that radiated from it seeped into my bones, making me feel as if I was freezing from the inside out. And then it stepped closer. The distance between us narrowed until it was right there, right in front of me. I could feel its presence like a weight pressing against my chest, making it hard to breathe. My lungs burned with the effort to inhale, but it felt like the air had turned to stone, hard and thick, making every breath a struggle. The whisper came again, this time louder, more urgent. It was a command. Look at me. I wanted to close my eyes, to block it out, to pretend that it wasn't real. But I couldn't. My body moved against my will, my head tilting slightly, my eyes unwillingly rising to meet the void where its face should have been. I could feel it, its gaze, even though it had no eyes. It was as though it was staring right into my soul, reading every secret, every fear, every thought. It knew me. It knew everything about me, everything I had ever done, everything I had ever thought. It knew my weaknesses, my guilt, my shame. You shouldn't have come here. The words wrapped around me like a shackle, each syllable heavier than the last. They were the weight of all the mistakes I had made, the things I had tried to forget. I felt myself trembling, my mind starting to unravel, as though the very fabric of my reality was being torn apart. And then, the figure reached out. Its long, twisted hand hovered before me, inches from my face. I could see it now, the skin of its fingers, thin and stretched, the bones beneath sharp and angular, as if it wasn't really meant to have a body. I could hear it, faintly, the creak of joints that shouldn't move, the scrape of nails against the air. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't scream. It was too close. Too real. I was trapped, caught in a nightmare that I couldn't escape. The figure's hand reached for me, its fingers brushing against my face, and everything inside me screamed to run. But I couldn't. My legs wouldn't move, my arms wouldn't lift. I was frozen in place, locked in an invisible vice, unable to do anything but stand there as it slowly, methodically reached out. Its touch was ice cold. It felt like it was draining the warmth from my skin, from my very soul. A wave of nausea hit me, and I wanted to collapse, to break free. But the touch never wavered. It held me in place, its grip tightening, suffocating. And then, just as I thought I was going to die from the pressure of it, it pulled back. The figure stepped away, its presence still heavy in the air, but no longer touching me. I could breathe again, but every breath felt shallow, weak. It was as though it had taken something from me, something vital, something important. I could feel it deep inside me, a void where something should have been. You will not leave this place. The whisper echoed once more, louder now, as if the very walls were shaking with its power. The sound vibrated through me, rattling my bones, clawing at my mind. I could feel it, its power, its influence. It was everywhere, closing in around me, suffocating the last vestiges of hope. And then, something strange happened. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, staring at me with its empty, featureless face. For a moment, the air was still. The silence between us was almost peaceful, like the calm before a storm. I couldn't explain it. I didn't understand it. But the fear, the terror, the suffocating presence that had filled the basement started to fade. Slowly, imperceptibly. The walls seemed to draw back, the shadows retreating into the corners. The temperature, once freezing, began to warm. The suffocating pressure that had pressed down on me was lifting, just a little. I didn't dare move. I didn't trust it. But for the first time since entering this cursed basement, I felt a glimmer of something else. Was it pity? Regret? Something like remorse? I couldn't say. But the figure, the thing, no longer seemed to be a threat. It seemed trapped. Trapped in the same way I was. Trapped in the same place. The oppressive weight of its presence was gone, replaced by an overwhelming sense of exhaustion, as if it had given up. As if it had already won. I didn't know what was happening. All I knew was that the door was still locked, and I had no way of leaving. I was still stuck here, but I wasn't sure if it was the figure holding me here, or if it was something else. You shouldn't have come here. It repeated again, quieter this time, as if it were telling itself the same thing. And then, without another word, it vanished. The basement was empty. Silent. I blinked, confused, disoriented, but the coldness was gone. The shadows were just shadows again. I was left standing alone in the darkness, my heart racing, my mind struggling to make sense of what had just happened. Was it real? Had I imagined it all? I didn't know. But one thing was certain, I had disturbed something. Something old, something powerful. Something that I would never forget. And I would never forget what had happened here. Have you ever wondered what might be hidden behind the walls of your own home? It was a question that had been rattling around in my head for weeks. I had lived in this old house for years, long enough to think I knew every creaky floorboard and every hidden nook. But there was something about the place, something that made it feel unfinished. As if there was more to it than I could see, a mystery buried in its very bones. It started with the noise. It was subtle at first, just a faint tapping, almost like a distant knock on a door, coming from somewhere deep within the house. I tried to ignore it, thinking it was just the house settling. But the sound persisted, and after a while, it began to gnaw at my nerves. Each time it came, I felt it echo through the walls, reverberating in the quiet of my thoughts. It wasn't the kind of sound that could be easily ignored. It was deliberate, persistent. It felt as if the house itself was trying to speak to me. One evening, as I was walking through the hallway, I heard it again, a faint thump, coming from the wall near the staircase. This time, it was followed by the sound of something scraping, as if something was being dragged across the floor. I paused, standing still, heart pounding in my chest. It was coming from the wall. The wall. I had never noticed anything unusual about that part of the house. The hallway was narrow, dimly lit by the soft glow of the lamps hanging overhead. The walls were old but sturdy, their surface smooth, undisturbed. But now, standing there, I could feel something shift in the air, as though the very space around me was thick with secrets. I reached out and pressed my hand against the cold surface of the wall. There was nothing unusual about it, nothing that seemed out of place. But the sound, the scraping, the tapping, it was still there, like an insistent whisper, begging to be heard. I couldn't just let it go. Curiosity tugged at me, and before I knew it, I had grabbed a flashlight from a nearby drawer and started searching the wall. I ran my fingers along the seams of the wallpaper, feeling for any irregularity. My heart raced as I traced every corner, every crack, searching for a sign that something had been hidden from view. And then, I found it. A slight indentation. Small, barely noticeable, just below the level of the baseboard. I pressed my finger into it, and the wall shifted slightly under the pressure, just enough for me to notice. My pulse quickened as I pushed harder, feeling the give beneath my touch. The sound of the scraping seemed to fade, as if it was waiting, too. With a final push, the wall creaked, and a section of it shifted, revealing a narrow crack, just wide enough for me to slip my hand inside. I hesitated for a moment, the adrenaline coursing through my veins. There was no turning back now. With a sudden jerk, I pulled the panel open. The passage was dark, cloaked in shadows that stretched long across the floor. A faint, musty smell drifted out from the hidden space, a mixture of old wood and something else, something I couldn't place. I couldn't see much, but I could feel the air was heavier in here, the silence more pronounced. It felt wrong, but I couldn't resist. I stepped inside. The passage was narrow, barely wide enough for me to move without brushing my shoulders against the walls. The air was thick with dust, and every step I took stirred up particles that swirled in the beam of my flashlight. The further I went, the colder it became. My breath came out in small puffs, and I felt an unexplainable chill crawl down my spine. I kept walking, drawn forward by an inexplicable force, as if the passage itself was beckoning me deeper into its depths. And then, I saw it. At the end of the passage was a door, old, wooden, and slightly ajar. I could see the faint outline of something through the gap, something unfamiliar. My heart raced in my chest, and a part of me wanted to turn back, but I couldn't. Not now. I reached for the door. It creaked loudly as I pushed it open, and the light from my flashlight revealed a small room beyond. At first, I thought it was empty, but then I saw it, sitting in the middle of the floor, bathed in the pale light of my flashlight, was a collection of old, yet perfectly new, children's toys. A dollhouse, its paint still bright and unchipped. Wooden trains, their wheels pristine and untouched. A teddy bear, its fur soft and clean, sitting upright as if waiting for someone to play with it. But there was something wrong. I couldn't place it at first, but it hit me then, a strange, uncomfortable feeling like an itch under my skin. These toys were too perfect, too pristine. They looked like they had never been touched, never been used, as though they had been placed there just for me to find. I stepped closer, the hairs on the back of my neck rising. It was like stepping into someone else's past, a past that didn't belong to me. The room was frozen in time, as if it had been waiting for someone to open that door, to find it. My flashlight flickered, casting strange shadows on the walls. I could hear the faint sound of scratching, something moving, coming from behind me, but when I turned, there was nothing. Just a passage, stretching back into darkness. Something was wrong here. Something was off. But what? The air in the room grew heavier as I stood there, frozen in place, staring at the untouched toys. My breath came in shallow gasps, the strange feeling of unease growing with every second that passed. It was as if the room was alive with secrets, a place where time had stopped, and something was waiting. I took another step forward, my feet moving almost against my will. My flashlight beam danced over the toys, highlighting their unnatural perfection. I reached out, trembling, and picked up the teddy bear. Its fur was so soft, almost too soft, as if it had never been touched by time. There was no dust, no sign of wear. It was as if it had been placed there just moments ago, yet it felt wrong, unnaturally still. As I held the bear in my hands, I felt something shift in the air. A subtle change, like a shift in the pressure around me. The room seemed to grow colder, the temperature dropping in a way that made my breath mist in the flashlight's beam. The silence was suffocating, pressing in from all sides. And then, the scratching sound returned. It was faint at first, just a soft scraping against the floor. But as I listened, it grew louder, more distinct, and closer. My heart hammered in my chest, and I spun around, expecting to see something, someone. But the passage was still empty. The door I had just entered through was still ajar, its faint outline casting a sliver of light into the room, but there was no one behind me. I turned back to the toys, my pulse racing. The scratching sound was relentless now, echoing in the room like claws dragging across the floor. It was coming from behind me, somewhere within the room. My eyes darted around, but there was nothing there. Nothing except for the toys, the dust, and the darkness that seemed to gather around me. Then, I saw it. In the corner of the room, partially obscured by a tall shelf, there was a shadow. At first, I thought it was just the way the light was casting strange shapes on the wall. But as I looked closer, I saw it move. Just a flicker, but it was enough to send a jolt of terror through me. I moved toward it, my feet dragging, unwilling to go but unable to stop. I approached the corner slowly, my flashlight illuminating the dark space. The shadow was gone, but now there was something else, something that hadn't been there before. A small, wooden door, barely noticeable, was embedded in the wall. It was hidden in the corner, half covered by an old, faded rug. I hadn't seen it before. How could I have missed it? I felt a cold shiver crawl up my spine as I crouched down to get a closer look. The door was old, its surface worn, and the wood was splintered in places. The edges of the doorframe were cracked, as if it had been there for years, waiting to be discovered. But there was no handle, just a strange, rusted keyhole. My hand hovered over it, unsure of what I was about to do. Something told me that opening this door would reveal something I wasn't ready to see, something I wasn't meant to find. But I couldn't stop myself. The pull was too strong. I reached out, and to my surprise, the door creaked open without resistance. The moment the door opened, I was hit with a wave of cold, stale air. It smelled damp, musty, like something had been locked away for far too long. A faint light flickered from inside, casting an eerie glow on the floor in front of me. My heart pounded in my chest as I stepped inside. The room beyond was small, barely large enough to turn around in. The walls were covered in dark, faded wallpaper, peeling in places, revealing the wood underneath. The floor was bare, except for a single object in the center of the room. A crib. It was small, made of dark wood, and the blankets inside were perfectly arranged, as if someone had just placed them there. But there was no baby. There was no sign of life. It was empty. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been in that crib, something that shouldn't have been. As I stepped closer, I felt a shift in the air again, colder this time, and the scratching sound, closer still, came from behind me. I spun around, heart pounding in my ears, expecting to see something, anything. But there was nothing. The room was silent once more. But the feeling of being watched, of being followed, was undeniable. I wasn't alone in this house. And I knew, deep down, that whatever had been hidden in this secret room had not been waiting for years without reason. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind me, the noise so loud that it made me jump. I turned quickly, but the door wouldn't budge. I pressed my shoulder against it, trying to force it open, but it was as if it had fused with the wall, refusing to move. I pounded on the door, panic rising in my chest. This wasn't supposed to happen. This wasn't real. And then I heard it. A soft, slow breathing coming from the crib. I froze. The blankets in the crib shifted. I dared not move. I stood there, frozen, my breath caught in my throat, my heart hammering in my chest. And then I saw it. A small, pale hand reaching out from beneath the blankets. I stood there, my feet rooted to the spot, unable to breathe as the pale hand slowly emerged from beneath the blankets. It was small, delicate, but there was something wrong about it. The skin was too pale, almost ghostly, and the fingers were too thin, too long. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end, a cold shiver running down my spine. The hand didn't move much, just barely twitching in the dim light of the room. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body was paralyzed, frozen in place as the hand reached a little further, its fingers curling in the air as if it was searching for something. Then, a low, raspy voice, so soft it was almost a whisper, filled the room. "You found me." I couldn't place where it came from. It wasn't from the crib, not from the hand. It was all around me, like the walls themselves were speaking. The voice sounded wrong, distorted, as if it came from a place far beneath the surface, deep within the house. A pulse of terror gripped my chest. I took a step back, my mind racing, but my feet were glued to the floor. My heart thudded in my ears, and the air around me seemed to thicken with every second. I could hear the low, unsettling sound of the breathing behind me again, closer now, more pronounced. I turned, my flashlight shaking in my hand. The light flickered, its beam casting strange, jagged shadows along the walls. For a moment, I thought I saw something moving in the corner of my eye, just a shadow, but it seemed to grow, stretching out like a figure. I stumbled backwards toward the crib, my eyes never leaving the hand, now slowly rising above the edge of the blankets. The voice whispered again, this time more insistent, more demanding. "Please, don't go." The words were barely audible, but they felt like a command, pulling at the very core of my being. I had to leave. I had to get out. But my legs felt heavy, as if the weight of the room itself was holding me captive. My mind raced, desperate to find an explanation, anything to justify what I was seeing, hearing. But there was none. There was no reason for a child's hand to be reaching from a crib in this forgotten room, no explanation for the voice that echoed from the very walls. I took a deep breath, summoning all the strength I could muster. The door was still locked, but there had to be another way out. I glanced around the room, scanning every inch of it for any escape. But my flashlight beam kept bouncing back to the crib, back to the hand that was now halfway out, its fingers twitching with an almost unnatural urgency. And then it happened. A faint sound, almost like a whisper in my ear, but it wasn't from the crib, and it wasn't from the shadows. It came from behind me. Turn around. My body refused to obey. My throat clenched tight, and I fought to control my breathing. There was something behind me, something I couldn't see. I could feel it, cold and heavy, like the air had thickened into a physical presence. I couldn't ignore it any longer. Slowly, trembling, I turned around. The moment I did, the flashlight beam illuminated a figure standing in the doorway. A woman. Her face was pale, gaunt, and her eyes were wide, empty, hollow. Her long hair hung in tangled strands around her face, and her clothes were old, worn. She was standing so still, so silently, that for a moment I thought she might be a figment of my imagination, a trick of the light. But then, she moved. Her lips parted, and she whispered the same words, her voice a rasp that sent a wave of ice through me. Please, don't go. The air around me seemed to press in, thick and suffocating. I took a step back, my mind screaming for me to run. But the woman didn't move. She remained frozen in the doorway, her eyes locked on mine. The room grew darker, colder, and the distant scratching sound, now louder than before, echoed in my ears. Why are you here? I managed to force out, my voice trembling. The woman didn't answer immediately. Instead, she slowly raised a hand, pointing toward the crib. Don't wake him, she whispered, her voice so soft that it barely registered in my ears. He doesn't like to be disturbed. I didn't understand. My heart pounded in my chest as I glanced at the crib again. The hand was no longer there. The blankets were empty. But something else was in its place. A figure, barely visible, sat in the crib, its back turned to me. The small, pale form was hunched over, motionless. A sense of dread washed over me as I realized that whatever had been in that crib was now standing, waiting, watching. Suddenly, the room seemed to contract, the walls pressing in, the air growing thick with a weight I couldn't bear. The woman in the doorway didn't move, her eyes still locked on mine. But I could feel the presence behind me, feel it drawing closer. I didn't wait for another sign. I turned and bolted toward the door, my heart pounding in my chest. My hand scrabbled at the doorknob, but it was still stuck, locked from the inside. My panic grew, but I refused to stop. My eyes darted around the room, searching for anything, any way out. That's why I saw it. At the far side of the room, beneath the window, was a small trapdoor, just big enough for me to fit through. I ran toward it, my hands trembling as I grabbed the latch and yanked it open. The darkness below it seemed to swallow the light from my flashlight, but it was my only chance. Without thinking, I dropped through the trapdoor. The moment I landed, I felt the air shift again, and the whispering voice returned, this time louder, closer, as if it had followed me. Don't leave. The trapdoor slammed shut above me, and I was left in the cold, suffocating darkness. The darkness enveloped me as the trapdoor slammed shut, leaving me in an oppressive, suffocating blackness. My breath was sharp and quick, echoing in the tight space around me. I stood there for a moment, disoriented, my hands searching for anything to steady myself. The air was thick, damp, and stale, a musty smell clinging to everything. I couldn't tell how deep the space was, or even what I was standing on. It felt like dirt, rough and uneven beneath my feet. The weight of the silence pressed in on me. I could hear my pulse thudding in my ears, louder than any sound I'd ever heard before. My flashlight was still in my hand, but it offered little comfort. The beam cut through the blackness like a knife, but it barely illuminated anything more than a few inches in front of me. I swallowed, forcing myself to calm down, to think clearly. The whispering voice from before still echoed in my head, the words lingering, "Don't leave." It felt like a warning, but it was also a command. I had to find a way out of here, had to get away from whatever was in that room, whatever was following me. Slowly, I took a cautious step forward. The floor beneath me was rough, uneven, like the space I had entered wasn't meant to be seen, like it had been forgotten for a long time. The walls, too, were cold and rough. I moved cautiously, the sound of my footsteps the only noise in this vast, suffocating silence. The air seemed to grow colder with each step I took. My breath misted in front of me, freezing the space around me. It wasn't just cold, it felt like the temperature was dropping with each passing second. I wrapped my arms around myself, trying to conserve warmth, but it was useless. The cold felt like it was seeping into my bones. I forced myself to move forward, the uncertainty growing with each step. The trapdoor had closed behind me, but I had no idea where I was now. There were no sounds, no echoes, nothing to guide me. I was lost in this place. I could feel it, something was in here with me. Watching. Waiting. Then, I heard it. A soft sound at first, almost imperceptible, like the faintest shuffle of footsteps behind me. It was quick, like someone moving just out of my sight, keeping just enough distance to stay hidden in the dark. My heart skipped a beat. I froze. My breath caught in my throat as I listened. The sound came again, closer this time. There was no mistaking it. Someone, or something, was moving just behind me. I spun around, my flashlight beam slicing through the dark, but there was nothing there. Just the oppressive, suffocating blackness that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. I took a deep breath, summoning all the strength I could muster. The door was still locked, but there had to be another way out. I glanced around the room, scanning every inch of it for any escape. But my flashlight beam kept bouncing back to the crib, back to the hand that was now halfway out, its fingers twitching with an almost unnatural urgency. And then it happened. A faint sound, almost like a whisper in my ear, but it wasn't from the crib, and it wasn't from the shadows. It came from behind me. Turn around. My body refused to obey. My throat clenched tight, and I fought to control my breathing. There was something behind me, something I couldn't see. I could feel it, cold and heavy, like the air had thickened into a physical presence. I couldn't ignore it any longer. Slowly, trembling, I turned around. The moment I did, the flashlight beam illuminated a figure standing in the doorway. A woman. Her face was pale, gaunt, and her eyes were wide, empty, hollow. Her long hair hung in tangled strands around her face, and her clothes were old, worn. She was standing so still, so silently, that for a moment I thought she might be a figment of my imagination, a trick of the light. But then, she moved. Her lips parted, and she whispered the same words, her voice a rasp that sent a wave of ice through me. "Please, don't go." The air around me seemed to press in, thick and suffocating. I took a step back, my mind screaming for me to run. But the woman didn't move. She remained frozen in the doorway, her eyes locked on mine. The room grew darker, colder, and the distant scratching sound, now louder than before, echoed in my ears. "Why are you here?" I managed to force out, my voice trembling. The woman didn't answer immediately. Instead, she slowly raised a hand, pointing toward the crib. "Don't wake him," she whispered, her voice so soft that it barely registered in my ears. "He doesn't like to be disturbed." I didn't understand. My heart pounded in my chest as I glanced at the crib again. The hand was no longer there. The blankets were empty. But something else was in its place. A figure, barely visible, sat in the crib, its back turned to me. The small, pale form was hunched over, motionless. A sense of dread washed over me as I realized that whatever had been in that crib was now standing, waiting, watching. Suddenly, the room seemed to contract, the walls pressing in, the air growing thick with a weight I couldn't bear. The woman in the doorway didn't move, her eyes still locked on mine. But I could feel the presence behind me, feel it drawing closer. I didn't wait for another sign. I turned and bolted toward the door, my heart pounding in my chest. My hand scrabbled at the doorknob, but it was still stuck, locked from the inside. My panic grew, but I refused to stop. My eyes darted around the room, searching for anything, any way out. That's when I saw it. At the far side of the room, beneath the window, was a small trapdoor, just big enough for me to fit through. I ran toward it, my hands trembling as I grabbed the latch and yanked it open. The darkness below it seemed to swallow the light from my flashlight, but it was my only chance. Without thinking, I dropped through the trapdoor. The moment I landed, I felt the air shift again, and the whispering voice returned, this time louder, closer, as if it had followed me. "Don't leave." The trapdoor slammed shut above me, and I was left in the cold, suffocating darkness. The darkness enveloped me as the trapdoor slammed shut, leaving me in an oppressive, suffocating blackness. My breath was sharp and quick, echoing in the tight space around me. I stood there for a moment, disoriented, my hands searching for anything to steady myself. The air was thick, damp, and stale, a musty smell clinging to everything. I couldn't tell how deep the space was, or even what I was standing on. It felt like dirt, rough and uneven beneath my feet. The weight of the silence pressed in on me. I could hear my pulse thudding in my ears, louder than any sound I ever heard before. My flashlight was still in my hand, but it offered little comfort. The beam cut through the blackness like a knife, but it barely illuminated anything more than a few inches in front of me. I swallowed, forcing myself to calm down, to think clearly. The whispering voice from before still echoed in my head, the words lingering, "Don't leave." It felt like a warning, but it was also a command. I had to find a way out of here, had to get away from whatever was in that room, whatever was following me. Slowly, I took a cautious step forward. The floor beneath me was rough, uneven, like the space I had entered wasn't meant to be seen, like it had been forgotten for a long time. The walls, too, were cold and rough. I moved cautiously, the sound of my footsteps the only noise in this vast, suffocating silence. The air seemed to grow colder with each step I took. My breath misted in front of me, freezing the space around me. It wasn't just cold, it felt like the temperature was dropping with each passing second. I wrapped my arms around myself, trying to conserve warmth, but it was useless. The cold felt like it was seeping into my bones. I forced myself to move forward, the uncertainty growing with each step. The trapdoor had closed behind me, but I had no idea where I was now. There were no sounds, no echoes, nothing to guide me. I was lost in this place. I could feel it, something was in here with me. Watching. Waiting. Then, I heard it. A soft sound at first, almost imperceptible, like the faintest shuffle of footsteps behind me. It was quick, like someone moving just out of my sight, keeping just enough distance to stay hidden in the dark. My heart skipped a beat. I froze. My breath caught in my throat as I listened. The sound came again, closer this time. There was no mistaking it. Someone, or something, was moving just behind me. I spun around, my flashlight beam slicing through the dark, but there was nothing there. Just the oppressive, suffocating blackness that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. My breath came faster now. I was trapped, alone in this cold, dark space, with nothing but the faint sounds and the overwhelming feeling that I wasn't alone. Whatever it was, whatever had followed me, it was here. And it wasn't going to let me leave. The footsteps came again, louder this time. But this time, they weren't behind me. They were in front of me. I could hear them moving, slow and deliberate, as if whatever it was circling me. I tried to move forward, to get away from the sound, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the thing in the dark was always one step ahead. My mind was racing. The walls seemed to close in on me, the air getting thicker with every breath I took. Then, I saw something, a faint light, flickering in the distance. It was weak at first, barely noticeable, but it was enough to make my heart leap with hope. An exit? A way out? I hurried toward the light, my feet stumbling over the uneven ground. The light grew stronger as I approached, and I could hear it, voices, faint but distinct, murmuring just beyond the reach of the light. The whispering was back, but it was different now. It was louder, more urgent. I reached the light and found myself standing in front of an old, wooden door, half ajar. The light came from the crack, spilling out from the room beyond. The whispers grew louder now, almost frantic. "Don't open it. Please don't open it." The voice was so clear now, so full of desperation. I felt my hand reach for the doorknob, almost against my will. The door felt cold, as if the very wood was alive, trembling under my touch. I hesitated, unsure whether I should open it or run in the opposite direction. My mind screamed at me to leave, to turn away from the door, but my body was already moving. I twisted the knob. The door creaked open with a sound that echoed in the silence of the room, and I stepped through. The room was dimly lit, the only light coming from a few scattered candles along the floor. The air was thick with the smell of burning wax, but there was something else, too, something foul, like rotting wood and mildew. The room was small, just as cramped as the space I had come from, but it felt different. There was something wrong about it. I took a step further into the room, and the door slammed shut behind me with a deafening crash. I spun around, panic flooding my chest, but the door was gone. The walls were solid, smooth, unyielding. I was trapped again. But this time, it wasn't just the walls that were closing in. In the center of the room, a figure stood. Its back was turned toward me, but I could see its silhouette in the dim light. It was tall, too tall, and its limbs seemed to stretch unnaturally in the shadows. The air seemed to hum with a strange energy, a vibration that made my skin crawl. the figure turned. It wasn't human. Its face was a twisted mockery of a person's, its skin pale and cracked, like porcelain. The eyes were dark voids, empty, with no trace of life. It reached out toward me, its fingers long and spindly, its movements jerky, unnatural. I couldn't move. I was frozen in place, my legs refusing to obey as the thing advanced, slow but sure, its presence suffocating every breath I took. "Leave," it whispered, its voice like the creak of ancient wood. And in that moment, I understood. It wasn't just me the house was after. It wanted something more. Something far worse than anything I had imagined. I didn't know how much time passed, but when I could move again, the figure was gone. The room was empty. The air was still. But the house wasn't done with me yet. I blinked, my eyes adjusting to the dim light around me. The room seemed unchanged, but I felt it, a shift in the air, a heaviness that hadn't been there before. The figure was gone, but something lingered, something that felt far worse. The silence was deafening, yet it was no comfort. Every creak of the old wood felt like a footstep, every distant hum a whisper. I wanted to run, to escape the suffocating sense of dread that wrapped around me like a noose. But my legs felt like lead. My body was frozen, as if the house had its grip on me, refusing to let go. I turned around, scanning the walls for any sign of an exit, anything that could offer me freedom. But the room seemed to stretch further than before. The walls, once close and oppressive, now felt endless, and the ceiling seemed to rise higher, darker. And then I saw it. On the far side of the room, a faint outline appeared in the shadows, something new. Something that hadn't been there before. A doorway. I squinted, uncertain whether it was real or a trick of my mind, but it was unmistakable. The door stood there, slightly ajar, beckoning me. I took a step toward it, my breath shallow and uneven. The floor creaked beneath me, but I kept going. Every step felt like it took me deeper into the unknown, into the heart of the house. The door grew larger, closer, until I could almost touch it. As I reached for the handle, the whispering began again, louder this time. It wasn't just one voice, it was many, overlapping, murmuring in a language I couldn't understand. The sound was deafening, like a storm of voices crashing against me. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. "Don't open it," the voice was unmistakable now. The same voice, the one I heard earlier. It wasn't a warning. It was a plea. I hesitated. My mind screamed at me to leave, to escape before whatever was behind that door could reach me. But the curiosity, the urge to understand, was stronger than the fear. I turned the knob. The door creaked open, and a blast of cold air hit me like a wave. I stumbled backward, my heart racing. The air smelled of decay, of something ancient and forgotten. The room beyond was dark, its depths unreachable by the dim light from the candles in the hallway. I stepped inside. The air grew colder, thicker, and the walls seemed to close in on me again, narrowing until I felt like I was suffocating. There were no windows, no light, just shadows that seemed to move, shifting and swirling around me. And then, in the far corner of the room, I saw them. The children. They were sitting there, still and silent, their eyes hollow and empty, staring at me from the darkness. Their clothes were fresh, new, but their faces were twisted with something I couldn't name. They were pale, their features warped, as if they had been sitting there for years, waiting for someone to come. I could hear their voices now, faint but clear, calling my name. Their lips didn't move, but the sound came from everywhere, filling the room with a chilling resonance. Leave. The whisper was everywhere, surrounding me, suffocating me. I could feel their presence, their cold eyes on me, their gazes piercing through me. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing in the silence. I turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind me. The room seemed to pulse with a life of its own, the walls shifting, pressing in on me from all sides. The children's voices grew louder, more insistent, as if urging me to stay, to join them. And then, in the center of the room, a figure emerged. The same twisted, grotesque figure from before. It stood in front of me, its cracked face staring down at me with hollow, empty eyes. "You shouldn't have come," it whispered. Its voice was low, guttural, like the sound of stone scraping against stone. "Now you're part of the house." I felt the walls closing around me, the air growing thick with an unbearable pressure. I gasped for breath, but it was like I was drowning. The figure reached out toward me, its fingers long and clawed, and in that moment, I knew. I was trapped. There was no escape. The house had claimed me. Have you ever felt like you were being watched? Not in the ordinary sense, but as if something or someone was silently following your every step, waiting for you to turn around just to prove that they are there? That's how it started for me. It was one of those calm evenings when the sky is a faint orange and the air is crisp but not yet cold enough to bite. I decided to go for a walk to clear my head after a long day. The forest near my house had always been a place of peace for me, a place to escape from the noise of life. I usually went there when I needed to think, and tonight it was no different. I walked down the path, my boots crunching lightly on the fallen leaves. The trees, tall and thick, stood like silent sentinels, their branches swaying gently in the wind. I always loved the sound of the leaves rustling, the way it seemed to drown out everything else, making the world feel smaller and more contained. But tonight, it felt different. As I walked deeper into the woods, I felt an odd unease creeping up my spine. I glanced around, trying to pinpoint what was wrong. The wind had died down, and all I could hear now was the soft thudding of my own footsteps. The forest felt strangely still, almost as if it were holding its breath. That's when I saw it. A figure stood between the trees, just a few feet off the path. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, a shadow cast by one of the thick trunks. But as I squinted, I realized that the figure was solid, unmoving. It was tall, dressed in dark clothing, with its back facing me. I couldn't see its face, just the silhouette against the fading light of the evening. I stopped in my tracks, my heart racing. My first instinct was to call out, but my voice seemed to catch in my throat. The figure didn't move. It was as if it didn't even notice me. I should have turned back. I should have run. But instead, I found myself stepping forward, drawn by some unknown force. My mind was screaming at me to leave, but my feet carried me closer, inch by inch. The figure didn't respond, didn't make a sound. It was as if it wasn't even alive, just an empty shell of something that had once been. I reached out, but as my hand approached, something stopped me. It wasn't the figure, it was the feeling. A cold chill washed over me, the kind that cuts to the bone. My breath hitched in my chest, and I quickly turned away, shaking my head. It was just my imagination, I told myself. It had to be. I hurried back down the path, not looking back. The sounds of the forest slowly returned to my ears, the wind picking up again, the rustling of the leaves. But that feeling, that lingering sense of being watched, never left me. It stayed with me all the way home, like an invisible shadow hanging over me. I reached my house, finally feeling the safety of the familiar. I closed the door behind me and leaned against it, trying to calm my racing heart. But something still felt off. I couldn't shake the image of that figure standing in the woods, still as stone. And then, as I passed the window, I froze. There, just outside, standing by the glass, was the same figure. It wasn't a trick of the light this time. I saw it clearly, its silhouette pressed against the window, unmoving, just like before. My blood ran cold. I couldn't move. My feet felt like they were rooted to the floor, and my breath was caught in my throat, as if the air itself was unwilling to fill my lungs. The figure, no, the silhouette, stood perfectly still outside, its shape barely visible through the frosted window. The more I stared, the more it felt as though the dark outline was not just a figure, but a presence, an entity that didn't belong there. I should have closed the curtains, locked the doors, and called someone, anyone, but instead, I stood there, unable to tear my eyes away. My heart pounded loudly in my chest, each beat a painful reminder that something was terribly wrong. The figure didn't move. It didn't even shift, as if it was waiting, patiently, for something. Then, I saw something that sent a jolt of terror through me. A faint movement, almost imperceptible, but enough to make my blood run cold. The figure raised its arm. Slowly, methodically, and I could see its hand pressing flat against the glass, as though it was trying to reach inside. I stumbled backward, my mind racing. This isn't real. It's not real. But no matter how much I told myself that, my body refused to believe it. The air in the room felt heavy, as though the walls were closing in, suffocating me. I turned away from the window, my legs trembling, and backed into the living room. The dim light from the hallway flickered, casting shadows across the floor. I tried to shake off the growing panic, but my mind couldn't focus on anything except that figure. That hand on the glass. Suddenly, a soft sound broke through the silence, an almost imperceptible scrape against the window, like a fingernail dragging lightly across the surface. I froze, every muscle in my body locking up. It's coming closer. It's trying to get in. I ran to the front door and slammed it shut, locking it with trembling hands. I checked all the other windows in the house, but the figure was nowhere to be seen. It was as if it had vanished, melted into the shadows. My breath came in ragged gasps, and I forced myself to calm down, telling myself that it was just my mind playing tricks. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I spent the rest of the night pacing back and forth, peeking through the blinds, half expecting to see that figure outside again. I didn't dare turn off the lights. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind, made my heart leap into my throat. I told myself that I was overreacting, that there had to be some logical explanation for everything. Maybe it was a prank, or someone just out for a walk, or even an illusion caused by the fading light. But nothing made sense. I couldn't escape the feeling that it was waiting for me, that the figure knew I was here, knew that I had seen it. As the night dragged on, the uncertainty of it all gnawed at me. I couldn't shake the thought that this wasn't the end, that something, someone, was going to find its way in. By the time the first light of dawn began to filter through the blinds, I thought I had finally convinced myself that I had been mistaken. But when I dared to peek outside, my blood ran cold again. There, standing by the tree near my front yard, was the figure. And this time, I could see its face. There was no mistaking it now. It wasn't just a shadow. It was real. I felt my knees weaken as I stumbled backward from the window. My mind was spinning in a haze, struggling to comprehend what I had just seen. The face, pale, lifeless, and featureless, stared directly at me. I could feel its gaze even through the distance, even through the glass, as if it were piercing through me, searching for something, waiting for me to make the next move. I backed away from the window, trembling. My hands shook uncontrollably, and I clutched the edge of the couch to steady myself. My breath came in shallow gasps. This isn't real. It can't be real. But the more I tried to convince myself, the more the sensation of that cold, empty stare took hold of me. I didn't know what to do. Call the police? But who would believe me? They'd think I was losing my mind. Or worse, what if it wasn't just a person standing outside, but something else? Something that couldn't be explained away? I took a step toward the door, then hesitated. What if the figure had moved? What if it was already inside, waiting for me in the dark corners of the house? Suddenly, the silence was shattered by a faint knock on the door. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. It wasn't the knocking of someone casually stopping by, no. It was slow, deliberate, as though the person, if it even was a person, was testing the door, making sure it was still locked. My blood ran cold. I crept over to the door, careful to stay out of view from the window. I couldn't risk making a sound. I wasn't sure what was worse, the possibility of the figure standing there, or the thought that it had already found its way inside. Another knock. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my phone and dialed the number of a friend, my fingers trembling as I held the device to my ear. The phone rang, each sound amplifying the unbearable tension. My friend picked up on the third ring, her voice groggy from sleep. "Hey, what's wrong?" she asked, sounding confused. I need you to come over," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to explain this, but something's outside my house." She paused, as if considering whether or not I was joking, but I heard the sudden shift in her tone. "What are you talking about?" "I saw something in the woods, and now it's at my window." "It's standing by the tree," I said, my words tumbling out in a frantic rush. "Please, just come here. I'm scared." There was a long pause on the other end, followed by a quiet sigh. "All right, I'm on my way. Stay inside. Lock every door. Don't open for anyone, okay?" "Okay," I whispered. "Hurry." I ended the call, heart pounding, but before I could even take a breath of relief, I heard a sound that made my blood freeze. A low, dragging scrape against the wooden floor. It was coming from upstairs. My body went numb, every instinct screaming at me to run, to escape. But my legs wouldn't move. The scrape continued, slow and methodical, as if something, was moving through the house with purpose. Each drag of the sound sent a ripple of dread through my spine. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. It was too deliberate. I moved toward the stairs, barely able to breathe, my heart in my throat. The scraping sound grew louder, closer. I could hear something shifting on the floor above, something heavy and slow, as if dragging itself along. I reached the foot of the stairs, clutching the railing for support. And then, I saw it. The shadow. It was small at first, but it grew larger as it moved closer to the top of the stairs, blocking the light from the hallway. It wasn't a person. It wasn't even a shape that could be described in human terms. It was a mass of darkness, an unnatural blackness that seemed to absorb the light around it, distorting the air like smoke. The shadow seemed to pause, as though it had become aware of my presence. I couldn't see what was behind it, but I knew it wasn't alone. And just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I heard it. A whisper, low and distant, but unmistakable. "Come closer." The whisper echoed in my ears, reverberating in the silence of the house. My heart stopped. "Come closer?" The words were soft, almost coaxing, but there was nothing comforting about them. It felt as though the very walls of the house were closing in, suffocating me with an invisible weight. I should have run. I should have bolted for the door, locked it, and never looked back. But my legs felt as though they were made of lead, unwilling to obey. The shadow at the top of the stairs shifted slightly, and in that moment, I knew, whatever it wasn't human. The whispers came again, louder now, more insistent. "Come closer." I didn't understand why I wasn't running. My instinct screamed at me to get out, to escape, but a part of me, a sick, twisted part, wanted to know more. What was it? Why was it here? Was it the same figure I had seen outside, or was it something worse? My breath hitched, and I found myself taking a tentative step forward, despite every fiber of my being screaming at me to stop. The shadow moved again, but this time it seemed to retreat just a bit, as if it was waiting for me to come closer. I edged up the stairs slowly, feeling like a puppet on a string. With each step I took, the temperature in the house seemed to drop. My skin prickled with cold, and I could see my breath fogging in front of me, despite the warmth of the evening outside. At the top of the stairs, the hallway stretched out before me, dark and silent. The shadow loomed ahead, its form barely distinguishable from the darkened hallway. I could feel its presence, thick and heavy, pressing down on me like an unbearable weight. And yet, I moved forward. The whisper came again, clearer this time, "Come closer." I reached out for the wall to steady myself, my fingers brushing against the cool, smooth surface of the old wallpaper. It felt unnervingly cold, as if it had absorbed the chill in the air. My feet moved against my will, step by step, drawing me toward the dark shape that was waiting for me. The hallway seemed endless, stretching on, but I could still hear the whisper, now so close I could almost feel it on my skin. Closer, closer. And then I saw it. A door at the end of the hallway, slightly ajar, as though inviting me inside. The door was familiar, too familiar. It was the door to the small room I'd never opened, the one that was hidden in the back corner of the attic. The room that my parents had warned me never to go into when I was a child. The door swung open just enough for me to see into the room, but there was something wrong about it. The light inside flickered, casting long, strange shadows that seemed to crawl across the floor. The room was filled with a musty, stale smell, as if it had been closed off for years. But the strangest thing of all was the way the walls were lined with old, dusty furniture that looked almost brand new. Children's toys scattered across the floor, untouched, as though they had been placed there just yesterday. Dolls. Wooden blocks. A crib. The whisper came again, this time louder, demanding, "Come in." I stood frozen, staring into the room. I knew I should turn away. I knew I should run. But something pulled me forward. A force, an undeniable compulsion, like a magnet drawing me in. I stepped into the room, and the door slammed shut behind me with a deafening thud. The room was still, silent. But I could feel the eyes on me, the weight of something watching from the corners of the room. I turned slowly, my eyes scanning the dark corners, the dust-covered furniture. The dolls seemed to stare at me with vacant, lifeless eyes. The shadows seemed to shift, to stretch, as if the very air was alive with an unseen presence. I took a shaky step forward, my breath catching in my throat, when I heard a sound behind me. The soft shuffle of footsteps. I spun around, heart hammering, but the room was empty. The door was closed, locked, as if it had never been opened at all. And then I saw it. A figure, standing in the corner, where I hadn't seen it before. The same dark figure that had been outside. The same one that had haunted me all night. It didn't move, not at first. It just stood there, its eyes, if they could even be called eyes, locked onto mine. And then, as I stood there, paralyzed with fear, it whispered one final time, its voice now a low growl. "You should never have come here." I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't obey. The figure at the corner of the room was still, yet its presence filled the entire space with an oppressive weight. My heart pounded in my chest, threatening to burst. The whisper, though faint, echoed in my mind again, a cruel reminder of the mistake I'd made. "You should never have come here." The room seemed to shrink around me. The walls, the floor, the furniture, it all felt like it was closing in. I could hardly breathe, the air thick and stifling, as though the room itself was suffocating me. My hands were shaking uncontrollably, and I could feel my legs weakening beneath me, threatening to give way. I backed up, slowly, my eyes never leaving the figure in the corner. The shadows stretched longer now, as if they were reaching for me. I could feel the temperature dropping, my breath visible in the air despite the warmth I knew was outside. My hand brushed the back of a chair, sending it rattling against the floor. It was the only sound in the room, yet it felt deafening. A cold draft swept through, and the toys on the floor shifted, as though something unseen was moving among them. "Come closer," the figure whispered again, its voice now a low rasp. The air seemed to vibrate with its command, a force pulling me forward against my will. I turned toward the door, my only hope of escape. The knob was cold to the touch, almost unbearably so. But as I tried to turn it, I found it locked. Panic surged in my chest. I shook the door, rattling the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The figure moved. It didn't walk, didn't glide, it just shifted. In an instant, it was no longer at the corner of the room, but standing directly in front of me, its form an indistinct mass of shadows, the face barely visible through the dark void. And those eyes, if they could even be called eyes, pierced through me. I couldn't look away. I could feel the weight of its gaze pressing down on me, suffocating me. "Why are you here?" The voice wasn't a whisper anymore. It was a low, guttural growl, the words dripping with malice. I tried to speak, but no sound escaped my lips. My throat was dry, my mouth sealed shut by fear. I stepped back, but the figure followed, its presence drawing closer and closer. It didn't move like anything human. It shifted through space, defying all logic, its form warping as if it were made of darkness itself. "You shouldn't have opened the door," the voice continued, now in my mind, like a pounding drum. "You shouldn't have known the truth." The air grew colder still, so cold I could feel it biting into my skin, numbing my limbs. My teeth began to chatter uncontrollably, but I couldn't stop. The fear, the panic, it was overwhelming. I had to get out. I had to escape. But the figure wasn't done. It stepped closer, and I felt a cold, unseen hand brush my shoulder. My body jerked, and I stumbled backward, crashing into the furniture behind me. The toys scattered, their clattering sound cutting through the silence. I looked down to see the doll, a porcelain one with lifelike eyes, staring up at me. The eyes seemed to gleam with something unnatural, something alive. And then the whisper came again, but this time it was clearer, more urgent. Run. I didn't need to be told twice. With a sudden burst of strength, I pushed away from the figure, throwing myself at the door. My hands fumbled desperately with the lock, but it wouldn't budge. The figure loomed behind me, just inches away. I could feel the cold radiating from it, consuming the air around me. The whisper came again, softer this time, almost in a tone of mockery. You should have left when you had the chance. Finally, the door gave way, and I stumbled out into the dark hallway, heart racing, breath ragged. I slammed the door shut behind me, locking it with trembling hands. The silence that followed was deafening. I stood there, gasping for air, my eyes wide in disbelief. The house was still. Too still. The figure was gone, but I could still feel its presence, like a dark shadow hovering just beyond my reach. I backed away from the door, every sense on high alert. And then, as I turned to flee down the hallway, I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, a shape moving at the edge of my vision, just outside the window. A figure, standing among the trees. The same figure. Watching. Waiting. And I knew, without a doubt, that I would never escape. The figure would always be there, just out of sight, just beyond the threshold, waiting for me to come back. And I would. Eventually. Have you ever seen something that made you question your own sanity? A moment so strange, so inexplicable, that it lingers with you long after it's over, gnawing at the edges of your mind? That was the kind of night it was, the night I saw the light in the alley. It was late, well past midnight. I was walking home after a long evening shift at the local diner, the kind of shift that leaves your feet sore and your mind numb. The streets were empty, the usual hum of the city reduced to a faint, distant murmur. The air had a chill to it, a sharp reminder that the cold months were settling in. I wasn't looking for anything out of the ordinary, just trying to get home. But as I turned the corner, something caught my eye. In the alley beside the abandoned building, a light flickered on. It wasn't the usual neon glow from a sign, nor was it the comforting warmth of a street lamp. This light was different, too bright, too sudden, as if it had appeared out of nowhere. I stopped in my tracks, squinting into the darkness. My first thought was that someone was out there, playing a prank or maybe trying to scare me. But the alley was eerily quiet, too quiet for anyone to be there, hidden in the shadows. The light stood alone, unmoving, as though it belonged there, though I knew it didn't. I hesitated. The alley was narrow, and it always gave me a strange feeling when I passed by. A sense of something being off. But tonight, it was different. The light, that constant, cold glow, seemed to be calling me. Without thinking, I found my legs carrying me forward, the sound of my footsteps muffled by the wet pavement. Each step brought me closer, and with every step, my unease grew. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up, a chill that wasn't entirely from the cold. It was as though something was watching me, waiting for me to come closer. When I reached the entrance of the alley, the light was brighter than ever, illuminating the space in front of me like an unnatural spotlight. But there was no source to it. No lamp, no fixture, just the glowing, pulsating light. I stepped forward cautiously, my heart racing now. The further I went, the stranger it felt. I glanced around, half expecting someone to jump out from the shadows, but there was nothing, just the light, steady and unblinking. Then, something caught my eye on the ground. At first, I thought it was just a shadow, but as I knelt down to take a closer look, I saw that it was a clock. A small, antique clock lying in the middle of the alley. Its face was cracked, the glass broken in places, but it still ticked. I couldn't understand it. The clock seemed out of place, completely out of place. It wasn't just old, it was too old. The kind of thing you might find in a dusty antique store, but not here, not in this alley. As I reached out to pick it up, the ticking grew louder, faster, and the sound filled the alley, echoing off the walls. My fingers brushed the cold metal surface, and I recoiled. It was freezing, almost painfully so. I steadied myself and turned the clock over. That's when I saw it. The hands were moving backward. Slowly at first, but then they began to spin faster, faster than I could follow. The numbers on the clock's face blurred into one mass of indecipherable symbols. My breath caught in my throat. Time itself, was going backward. I pulled my hand away, stumbling back. The air around me seemed to thicken, as though the very atmosphere had changed. The light flickered, dimmed, then brightened again, casting long shadows along the walls. The alley, once so familiar, now felt like a completely different place, a place where the rules of reality no longer applied. A noise broke the silence. A soft rustling behind me. I spun around, heart pounding in my chest. But there was nothing but the darkness stretching out behind me. I turned back to the clock, my mind racing. What was this? What had I found? I knew I needed to leave. I needed to get away from this strange, unnerving place. But as I took one last look at the clock, I noticed something else. The hands were still moving backward, but now they were impossibly fast. The moments were rushing past, spiraling backward into nothingness. And just like that, the alley fell silent. The light went out. I stood there in the dark, the faint tick of the clock still echoing in my mind. Time had reversed itself. But for how long? And what had I done? I stood there, motionless, the last echoes of the clock's ticking still ringing in my ears. The light had vanished, leaving the alley consumed by a suffocating darkness. For a moment, I thought it was a trick of the mind. Maybe the exhaustion from work had caught up with me, maybe I'd imagined it all. But deep down, I knew I hadn't. I turned away, half expecting to hear footsteps, a whisper in the wind, or even see someone lurking just beyond the shadows. But there was only silence, thick and heavy. The street ahead was still empty, no signs of life, no movement. The only sound was the distant hum of traffic, far off, as if the world had become quieter, smaller, somehow distant. I stepped backward, carefully retracing my steps. The air felt colder now, the kind of cold that doesn't let go. It wrapped around me like a vice, a persistent reminder that something was wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. As I reached the end of the alley, I paused. I glanced back, unable to resist. There was no light. No clock. No sign of anything unusual. Only the remnants of the fog that had begun to roll in. My pulse quickened, and I forced myself to turn away, my legs moving faster, pushing me toward home. But something wasn't right. The further I walked, the more uneasy I became. I glanced over my shoulder every few seconds, half expecting to see a shadow following me, a shape I couldn't quite place. But the street remained empty, and yet I felt as though something had shifted, like the very air around me had thickened, becoming oppressive. When I finally reached my front door, I fumbled with the keys, the familiar task now feeling foreign, as if my own hands were disconnected from my mind. I hurried inside, slamming the door behind me. I leaned against it, breathing hard, trying to calm my racing heart. But even inside, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The house felt off. The silence was deeper than usual, more profound. There was an unnatural stillness to it, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. I locked the door, my hands trembling, then moved toward the living room, hoping the routine of home would ground me. I flicked on the light, and my eyes immediately went to the window, just to check, to reassure myself. And then I saw it. The figure in the window. I froze, unable to breathe. For a split second, I thought I might be seeing things, that it was some lingering effect of the strange experience in the alley. But the figure stood there, motionless, its outline faint but unmistakable. A tall, shadowy silhouette against the dim light filtering through the curtains. My heart pounded in my chest, and a cold sweat broke out across my forehead. The shape didn't move. It didn't blink or wave. It just stood there, staring back at me. Forcing myself to move, I crept closer to the window, trying to make out more details, trying to convince myself it was nothing more than a trick of the light, a play of shadows. But as I peered closer, I realized something that made my stomach drop. The figure, it was me. Or rather, it looked like me. The shape was almost identical, standing in the exact position I was, framed by the window. The same posture, the same stillness. But there was no life in it, no movement. The figure stood frozen, its features indistinct, as though it were a reflection in a cracked mirror. I stumbled back, my breath coming in shallow gasps. My mind raced, but the only thing that seemed to make sense was the clock, the backward movement of time. What did it mean? What was happening? I shook my head, trying to clear my thoughts, but the more I thought about it, the more it seemed like the figure in the window wasn't just a reflection. It was waiting. And that's when I realized, if that was me, then it had been there all along. It had been watching me, waiting for me to come back, to look. I couldn't stand there any longer. I needed to move, to do something. But my legs wouldn't move. It felt like my body was frozen, as if the air around me had solidified. Every second stretched out, stretching into eternity. I turned away, stumbling backward, my mind swimming with panic. I rushed to my phone, but my hands were shaking too much to dial. I needed to get out of the house. I needed to leave, to escape whatever had followed me from that alley. But as I reached for the door, I heard it, a soft click, followed by the faintest of sounds, a ticking. The sound came from nowhere, but I knew. I knew what it was. The clock. I spun around, and there it was, sitting on the coffee table in front of me. The clock from the alley. The one with the broken glass. The one that ticked backward. My heart stopped. Time was slipping away. I didn't know what to do. The room seemed smaller now, suffocating, the air thick with dread. The clock on the table continued its maddening, rhythmic ticking, each beat echoing in my skull. The hands, twisted and warped, moved backward with unnatural precision, defying every law of time I understood. I watched it, mesmerized, helpless to stop it. The figure in the window was still there, still watching. I couldn't bring myself to look at it again, but I could feel its presence, pressing against me. I was trapped, ensnared between this impossible moment and the overwhelming terror building in my chest. I turned away from the clock, but the sound of the ticking grew louder, sharper, as if the clock were moving closer, as if it were closing in on me. My eyes darted around the room, desperately seeking any escape from this nightmare. But everything was wrong. The shadows stretched unnaturally long, reaching toward me as though they had a life of their own. I stumbled back, feeling the walls closing in. My mind raced. Was it the clock that had caused this? Had I somehow triggered something, opened a door I wasn't meant to open? I couldn't make sense of it. All I knew was that something had changed, and I was no longer in control. The room seemed to shift around me, as if the space itself were bending, warping. I pressed my hands against the wall, grounding myself, trying to hold on to something familiar, but it felt as if the house itself were moving, like a living thing, shifting beneath my feet. And then the ticking stopped. Complete silence. I held my breath, waiting for something. Anything. The absence of sound was worse than the clock's relentless ticking. It was like the world had paused, holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I dared not look at the clock. I knew it had stopped, but I couldn't bring myself to check. I could feel the presence of the figure, now inside the room with me, not through the window, but standing right behind me, just out of reach. Its cold gaze burned into my back, sending a shiver down my spine. Suddenly, I heard a whisper. It was faint at first, almost inaudible, but it grew clearer with every passing second until it filled the room. The voice wasn't mine, but it sounded so familiar, like an echo of my own thoughts. It spoke slowly, deliberately, as if testing the words before letting them fall into the space between us. "You're too late." The words hung in the air, chilling me to the core. I spun around, my heart pounding, but there was no one there. The figure in the window had vanished. The room was empty, too empty. I reached for the door again, my fingers brushing the handle, but before I could pull it open, the clock on the table began ticking once more, louder than before. The sound was deafening now, a constant, suffocating reminder of whatever nightmare I had unwittingly stumbled into. There was an unnatural stillness to it, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. I locked the door, my hands trembling, then moved toward the living room, hoping the routine of home would ground me. I flicked on the light, and my eyes immediately went to the window, just to check. To reassure myself. And then I saw it. The figure in the window. I froze, unable to breathe. For a split second, I thought I might be seeing things, that it was some lingering effect of the strange experience in the alley. But the figure stood there, motionless, its outline faint but unmistakable. A tall, shadowy silhouette against the dim light filtering through the curtains. My heart pounded in my chest, and a cold sweat broke out across my forehead. The shape didn't move. It didn't blink or wave. It just stood there, staring back at me. Forcing myself to move, I crept closer to the window, trying to make out more details, trying to convince myself it was nothing more than a trick of the light, a play of shadows. But as I peered closer, I realized something that made my stomach drop. The figure, it was me. Or rather, it looked like me. The shape was almost identical, standing in the exact position I was, framed by the window. The same posture, the same stillness. But there was no life in it, no movement. The figure stood frozen, its features indistinct, as though it were a reflection in a cracked mirror. I stumbled back, my breath coming in shallow gasps. My mind raced, but the only thing that seemed to make sense was the clock, the backward movement of time. What did it mean? What was happening? I shook my head, trying to clear my thoughts, but the more I thought about it, the more it seemed like the figure in the window wasn't just a reflection. It was waiting. And that's when I realized if that was me, then it had been there all along. It had been watching me, waiting for me to come back, to look. I couldn't stand there any longer. I needed to move, to do something. But my legs wouldn't move. It felt like my body was frozen, as if the air around me had solidified. Every second stretched out, stretching into eternity. I turned away, stumbling backward, my mind swimming with panic. I rushed to my phone, but my hands were shaking too much to dial. I needed to get out of the house. I needed to leave, to escape whatever had followed me from that alley. But as I reached for the door, I heard it, a soft click, followed by the faintest of sounds, a ticking. The sound came from nowhere, but I knew. I knew what it was. The clock. I spun around, and there it was, sitting on the coffee table in front of me. The clock from the alley. The one with the broken glass. The one that ticked backward. My heart stopped. Time was slipping away. I didn't know what to do. The room seemed smaller now, suffocating, the air thick with dread. The clock on the table continued its maddening, rhythmic ticking, each beat echoing in my skull. The hands, twisted and warped, moved backward with unnatural precision, defying every law of time I understood. I watched it, mesmerized, helpless to stop it. The figure in the window was still there, still watching. I couldn't bring myself to look at it again, but I could feel its presence, pressing against me. I was trapped, ensnared between this impossible moment and the overwhelming terror building in my chest. I turned away from the clock, but the sound of the ticking grew louder, sharper, as if the clock were moving closer, as if it were closing in on me. My eyes darted around the room, desperately seeking any escape from this nightmare. But everything was wrong. The shadows stretched unnaturally long, reaching toward me, as though they had a life of their own. I stumbled back, feeling the walls closing in. My mind raced. Was it the clock that had caused this? Had I somehow triggered something, opened a door I wasn't meant to open? I couldn't make sense of it. All I knew was that something had changed, and I was no longer in control. The room seemed to shift around me, as if the space itself were bending, warping. I pressed my hands against the wall, grounding myself, trying to hold on to something familiar, but it felt as if the house itself were moving, like a living thing, shifting beneath my feet. And then the ticking stopped. Complete silence. I held my breath, waiting for something. Anything. The absence of sound was worse than the clock's relentless ticking. It was like the world had paused, holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I dared not look at the clock. I knew it had stopped, but I couldn't bring myself to check. I could feel the presence of the figure, now inside the room with me, not through the window, but standing right behind me, just out of reach. Its cold gaze burned into my back, sending a shiver down my spine. Suddenly, I heard a whisper. It was faint at first, almost inaudible, but it grew clearer with every passing second until it filled the room. The voice wasn't mine, but it sounded so familiar, like an echo of my own thoughts. It spoke slowly, deliberately, as if testing the words before letting them fall into the space between us. "You're too late." The words hung in the air, chilling me to the core. I spun around, my heart pounding, but there was no one there. The figure in the window had vanished. The room was empty, too empty. I reached for the door again, my fingers brushing the handle, but before I could pull it open, the clock on the table began ticking once more, louder than before. The sound was deafening now, a constant, suffocating reminder of whatever nightmare I had unwittingly stumbled into. I had to leave. I grabbed the door handle, yanking it open, and burst into the hallway. My footsteps echoed through the house, but they sounded wrong. There was something off about the sound, something distant, like the house itself was hollow, waiting for something. The walls closed in around me as I rushed toward the front door. But just as I reached for the doorknob, I froze. The door was gone. Instead, a large, imposing mirror stood before me, reflecting my own wide-eyed panic. I reached out, my hand trembling, but when I touched the glass, it rippled under my fingertips like water. The reflection was no longer mine. It was the figure from the window. The same tall, shadowy form stood in the mirror, its hollow eyes staring back at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I stepped back, heart racing, but the reflection didn't move. It remained perfectly still, just as it had in the window. A new whisper echoed from the mirror. Time is already undone. I didn't understand. The words made no sense, but the terror that gripped me was real. My breaths came in short gasps, and my mind screamed at me to run, to escape, but I couldn't move. The house seemed to warp around me, the walls stretching, the floor pulsing beneath my feet. Time had stopped, but the clock was still ticking in my head, growing louder, unbearable. And then I heard it, footsteps. Slow, deliberate steps, coming from somewhere inside the house. Not behind me, not in front of me, but from all around. The sound filled the air, surrounding me, closing in. I whirled around, panic rising in my chest, but there was no one there. The hallway was empty, silent, save for those footsteps. They continued, but they weren't real. They were wrong, out of place, a part of the house itself. The reflection in the mirror started to move. It stepped toward me, the shadowy figure finally coming to life. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, like a marionette being pulled by unseen strings. Its eyes locked onto mine, and the whisper came again. "You're too late." I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest. I had no idea what it meant, what was happening. But I knew one thing for certain, I wasn't alone. And whatever this was, whatever had begun in the alley, it wasn't over. It was just beginning. The footsteps grew louder. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the reflection in the mirror. The figure had reached out toward me with slow, deliberate movements, as though it had all the time in the world to close the gap between us. It was a grotesque mockery of humanity, with its limbs twisted in unnatural angles, but the eyes, those hollow, lifeless eyes, were the most terrifying part. They locked onto mine, and I couldn't look away. The whisper came again, its voice colder now, more insistent. "Time is already undone." I pressed my back against the mirror, feeling its cool surface against my skin. The reflection moved with me, perfectly mimicking my every tremor, every twitch. But the figure in the mirror was not me. It was wrong. It was the thing that had been following me, the thing that had been waiting in the dark corners of this place. I reached for the mirror, trembling, my fingers brushing against the rippling surface as though it were made of liquid instead of glass. I needed to break it. I needed to destroy whatever was holding me here. But before I could act, the door behind me slammed shut, and I heard the lock click into place. I whipped around, but the door had already vanished, replaced by more mirrors, walls of mirrors, all reflecting my panic-stricken face, the figure, its dark, implacable eyes fixed on me. The footsteps outside the mirrors continued, now louder, closer. They circled me. The house was alive, alive with the sound of approaching footsteps, circling, closing in. My skin crawled as I tried to make sense of what was happening. Was this real? Was it happening inside my mind? Or was I trapped in a place where time and space had stopped making sense? "You're too late," the figure in the mirror repeated. "Too late to escape. Too late to understand." I turned back to the mirror, heart pounding in my chest. There was a part of me, a tiny part that still clung to the hope of escape, that thought I could somehow break free from this madness. But the figure wasn't waiting. It reached out again, its fingers stretching toward me, and in that moment, I realized I was the one trapped. The figure was me. Or, at least, something that had been me. I screamed, but no sound came out. The footsteps were now so close, so loud, that I couldn't tell if they were real or if they were just part of the growing madness in my head. I turned again, looking for an exit, any exit, but there was no door. No window. Only mirrors, surrounding me, closing in, reflecting my every move, every thought. I couldn't breathe. The air felt thick, suffocating, as though the house itself was constricting around me. And then, with a sudden crack, one of the mirrors shattered. The sound was deafening, a sharp, echoing burst of glass. I flinched, my body jerking back instinctively, but it wasn't the mirror that had broken. It was the world. The space around me. The floor beneath me buckled, and the walls seemed to collapse in on themselves, the mirrors falling away, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. The figure in the reflection, it stepped forward through the darkness, its fingers now inches from my face. Time had unraveled completely. The footsteps stopped. The silence was crushing. The figure leaned in, its shadow stretching over me, and for the first time, I could hear its voice clearly, not in whispers, but as though it was speaking directly into my mind. "You're already part of it. Time was never on your side." The air grew colder, and the darkness thickened, pressing in from all sides. I was suffocating in it. I had to do something, anything, to break free, to escape before the shadows swallowed me whole. I grabbed the broken pieces of the mirror that lay scattered across the floor, their sharp edges glinting in the dim light. I didn't know what I hoped to accomplish. Maybe to shatter the reflection? Maybe to destroy the thing that had been following me. I raised the shard, but before I could strike, the darkness enveloped me, pulling me down, dragging me into the cold, relentless void. And then, nothing. There was no sound. No feeling. Only the cold emptiness that swallowed everything. I woke up in the alley. The same alley where I had first seen the light. My head was spinning, my body aching, as I sat up on the cold pavement. The world around me was unnaturally still. The air felt different, heavy, thick with the weight of something unseen. Something that had been waiting for me. I stood, my legs trembling as I looked around. The alley was as I remembered it, except it felt wrong, too quiet, too still. The light at the end of the alley flickered, its glow harsh and unnatural. I stumbled toward it, my feet dragging as if I were wading through water. As I neared the light, I noticed something in the corner of my eye. A figure. Standing in the shadows, watching me. I froze. It was the same figure, the one I had seen in the mirrors. The one that had been haunting me. But now, it was standing there in the flesh, not in a reflection, not in a dream. It was real. And it was waiting. The whisper returned, but this time it wasn't in my mind. It was out loud, from the figure, its voice low, guttural. "Time, has already undone. I didn't understand, but I didn't need to. I knew then that I was no longer outside of it. I was inside it. The figure took a step toward me, its face now visible, a mirror of my own face, twisted and cracked. I backed away, but there was nowhere to go. The light above flickered again, and then everything went dark. And I understood. Time was no longer mine to control. It was never meant to be. I stood frozen in the pitch-black void, unable to move, unable to breathe. The air was thick with a suffocating weight, as though the darkness itself was pressing against my chest, pushing the breath from my lungs. The sound of my heart pounded in my ears, too loud, too frantic. The figure stood before me, its presence undeniable, as if it had always been there, waiting, watching. Its cold gaze fixed on me, and the whispers filled my mind again, louder this time. They weren't words anymore, they were images, fleeting flashes of things I couldn't quite grasp. Faces, places, moments frozen in time. I tried to look away, but my body was not mine to control anymore. The figure's eyes held me captive. Time is lost, it murmured, its voice distorted, almost as though it were echoing from the farthest corner of my soul. I didn't know how to respond. Didn't know what it meant. All I knew was that I wasn't supposed to be here. This wasn't supposed to be real. This wasn't supposed to be my world. I wanted to scream, but the words caught in my throat, tangled in the depths of the darkness. The more I struggled, the more the figure's grip tightened, its form growing clearer, sharper. I could see my reflection in its eyes now, a twisted version of myself. But there was no escaping. It had me. Where am I? My voice was hoarse, broken. The figure tilted its head, almost curiously, as if pondering whether to answer. Its movements were slow, deliberate, unnerving. Then, without a word, it extended a hand toward me, its fingers elongated, bony, and cold. I felt an overwhelming sense of dread as it reached for me, a magnetic force pulling me toward it. I recoiled instinctively, but it was no use. My legs, my arms, everything felt heavy, bound to the ground by an invisible force. "You're here," the figure said, its voice no longer a whisper, but a rasping, hollow sound that reverberated through my very being. "You've always been here." I shook my head, a flood of panic crashing over me. No, this wasn't true. I had come here by accident, stumbled upon something I wasn't meant to see, but now it felt like I was part of it, part of whatever twisted reality this was. The figure's eyes glinted, and for a moment I saw something in them, a fleeting image, a memory. It was me, years ago, standing in the very same alley, staring at the same light. Had I always been here? Had I walked through this moment again and again, trapped in an endless loop? I wanted to scream again, to fight back, to break free, but my body refused to move. And then, in an instant, the figure was right in front of me, its hand hovering just above my chest. I felt its coldness radiate from it, seeping into my skin, freezing me to the bone. "Time has already undone," it repeated, the words now taking on a finality that sent a chill down my spine. With one swift motion, it pressed its hand against my chest, and everything went dark. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, the light returned. I opened my eyes, blinking against the harsh glow, and found myself standing in the same alley. The same alley, but everything was wrong. The shadows were deeper, more menacing. The air felt heavier, as though the world around me had shifted into something darker, more twisted. The light above flickered again, casting long, distorted shadows. The figure wasn't there anymore, but I could feel its presence, lurking just beyond the edge of my vision. And I knew that I wasn't free. Not now. Not ever. Time had unraveled itself, and I was a part of it now. A part of something that could never be undone. I turned away from the light, but there was no escape. No way back to the world I once knew. The darkness followed me, wrapping itself around me like a cloak. Every step I took felt heavier, as though the weight of the world was pressing against me, drawing me deeper into the unknown. I had crossed the threshold. There was no turning back now. And somewhere, deep in the silence, the figure's voice echoed in my mind once more, not as a whisper, but as a final command. Time is gone. You are part of it. And then, I was swallowed whole. It's hard to know when fear starts, when the creeping feeling of unease becomes more than just a passing thought. You wonder if something has always been there, lurking in the corners of your mind, waiting for the right moment to strike. Have you ever felt that way? Like you're being watched, but every time you turn around, you see nothing? What if the shadows were real, and what if, just for a moment, they weren't so silent anymore? I had always been a night owl. The quiet of the house at night soothed me, gave me time to reflect, to think. It was always just me in the dim silence of the room, the rhythmic sound of my breathing mixing with the occasional creak of the house settling. But tonight was different. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the soft glow of the moon casting faint shadows across the room. The kind of shadows that dance when the wind brushes past the curtains. But as I watched, something felt off. One of the shadows, no, more than one, seemed to move, shifting in ways that didn't make sense. A slow, deliberate crawl, like fingers creeping across the ceiling, tracing unseen patterns. I blinked and rubbed my eyes, but when I looked again, the shadows were still there, moving in strange ways. They weren't like the usual play of light and dark. These shapes, they were wrong. Their movements didn't match anything that should have been in a room like mine. I could feel my pulse quicken, my body tensing with a familiar feeling of dread. I tried to tell myself it was just the light, just my eyes playing tricks on me. But the more I watched, the more real they seemed, like something, or someone, was up there, just above me, where I couldn't see them. The shadows grew longer, stretching across the walls. One seemed to detach from the others, and I froze. It looked like a figure. A person, standing still, watching. My heart raced, and I pulled the blanket tighter around me, hoping that if I couldn't see it, it couldn't see me. Minutes passed, or maybe it was hours. I couldn't tell. The shadows didn't stop, though. I tried to close my eyes, to block out the image of the figure, but every time I opened them, there it was. Watching. Waiting. At some point, exhaustion overwhelmed me, and I drifted into a restless sleep. But even in sleep, I couldn't escape the sensation of being watched. I dreamed of the figure. It was in my room, standing at the foot of my bed, its presence heavy, suffocating. Its outline was faint, but I could feel it. I could hear it breathing. Just as I was about to scream, I woke up with a jolt. The room was still dark, still silent. But there was something different. My gaze immediately went to the ceiling, and my heart sank. The shadows were gone, but something was wrong. I sat up slowly, my mind racing. I didn't want to move, but my feet seemed to take me toward the light switch against my will. I flicked it on, my breath catching in my throat. There, on the floor, were fresh shoe prints, too distinct, muddy prints as if someone had walked across the floor while I was asleep. They were too clear, too distinct to have been there when I went to bed. And yet, I hadn't heard a thing. No creaks. No footsteps. I turned to look at the door. Locked. Windows closed. The house was as it had always been. But now, something felt terribly, terribly wrong. I stood there, frozen in the middle of the room, staring at the prints on the floor. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Had I been dreaming? Had I sleepwalked? But no! The prints were too real. Too recent. My feet, still in my slippers, seemed to confirm that I hadn't gone anywhere. I backed away from the floor slowly, my hands trembling. The room was suffocating, the air heavy with a coldness that wasn't there before. I tried to breathe, tried to calm myself, but the silence felt deafening, as if the house itself was holding its breath. I wanted to call someone, anyone, but a strange sense of isolation wrapped around me. Who would believe me? Who would understand that something was wrong here, something beyond explanation? I glanced at the door, considering leaving, but my feet felt glued to the floor. The thought of stepping out into the hallway, into the dark corners of the house, terrified me. Instead, I turned my attention back to the shadows. The ceiling above me was now a clean slate, but I could still see the remnants of what I had witnessed earlier. It was as if the very air around me was thick with something unseen. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been up there wasn't done with me yet. I took a deep breath and walked cautiously toward the window. My hands shook as I pulled the blinds aside, half expecting to see the figure outside. But there was nothing. The night was still, the only movement the occasional rustle of the trees in the yard. Still, I couldn't shake the sense that I was being watched. That someone, or something, was waiting just out of sight. I backed away from the window, my heart pounding in my chest. I had to get out of here. I had to leave. But where would I go? The house felt trapped. I felt trapped. As I turned to face the rest of the room, something caught my eye. On the wall, near the corner where the shadows had been dancing, there was a small, dark stain. It hadn't been there before. I stepped closer, my breath catching in my throat. It wasn't a stain, though. It was a handprint. A faint, almost ghostly handprint, as if someone had pressed their palm against the wall and left a trace of something darker than the surrounding paint. I recoiled, my heart racing. What was happening? What was this? I couldn't process it. The walls were closing in around me, the air thick with a tension I couldn't escape. I didn't want to turn around. I didn't want to look behind me. But something compelled me to do it. As my eyes swept across the room, my gaze landed on the bed, and there it was. A figure, standing still at the foot of the bed. Its outline was faint, almost imperceptible in the dim light, but it was there. I could feel it. My blood ran cold. I froze. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. It simply stood there, as if waiting for something, as if waiting for me to acknowledge it. But I couldn't. I couldn't look at it. I couldn't face it. I stumbled backward, tripping over my own feet, and with one last glance toward the corner of the room, I bolted for the door. I didn't stop to think. I didn't care where I was going, just as long as I was away from there. Away from the thing that was watching me. Away from the silence that had become so deafening. I ran down the hallway, my breath ragged, my heart pounding in my ears. But as I reached the stairs, I froze. A figure stood at the bottom, silhouetted in the pale light from the hallway lamp. It was the same figure, the one from the shadows, and it was smiling. I lay still, unable to look away from the shadows stretching across the ceiling above me. It felt like they were alive, twisting and flickering as if they were aware of me watching. I kept telling myself it was just a play of light from the street lamp outside. The house creaked with every gust of wind. But no matter how much I tried to rationalize it, there was something unsettling about the movement of those shadows. They weren't the usual patterns of the blinds or the faint flutter of leaves against the window. These shapes, they had a life of their own. They slithered, stretched, and seemed to dance in ways that defied natural movement. A sharp chill ran down my spine. What if they weren't shadows at all? I turned my head to the side, trying to ignore the creeping fear building in my chest. I could hear the distant hum of traffic outside, the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. But there was something different. Something that I couldn't quite place. The longer I stared at the ceiling, the more the shadows seemed to shift. Now, they looked like hands, fingers reaching down from above. I could almost feel them, grazing my skin. But no, it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to force myself to sleep, to push away the dread that tightened around my throat. But the darkness only deepened. The shadows grew longer, more defined, and I was sure now, whatever they were moving closer. A cold breath brushed against my neck, sending me into full alertness. I didn't dare open my eyes, didn't want to see the thing that was there. But I could feel it. It was real. The shadows on the ceiling, they weren't shadows anymore. With a trembling hand, I reached for the bedside lamp, flicking it on. The room flooded with light, and the shadows vanished, leaving behind only the familiar, quiet walls of my bedroom. I exhaled, relieved, but something still felt wrong. There was no reason for me to feel this way. I was just tired. The shadows, the cold breath, they were just a product of my overactive imagination. Still, as I sat there in the sudden brightness of the room, I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, had been in my room just moments before. I glanced toward the floor, where the carpet lay undisturbed. My eyes scanned the edges of the room, half expecting to see something lurking in the corners, but there was nothing. It wasn't until morning that I noticed the tracks on the floor. Morning light filtered through the curtains, casting soft, golden beams across the room. For a moment, everything seemed peaceful again, and the unsettling feeling from last night began to fade, replaced by the routine of a new day. I tried to shake off the tension from the night before, but something kept nagging at me. I swung my legs over the side of the bed and stood up. The floor was cold beneath my feet. As I took a few steps toward the window, I caught a glimpse of something unusual. There, on the hardwood floor, were faint impressions, like someone had walked through the room during the night. My heart skipped a beat. I bent down, running my fingers over the tracks. They were not deep, but distinct. The marks were too fresh to have been there long, and too deliberate. They appeared to be the outline of shoes, leaving dark, dusty prints that formed a trail leading from the corner of the room where the shadows had been last night, to the door. I froze. I hadn't heard anyone enter my room. No sound of footsteps, no creak of the door, nothing. I couldn't shake the thought that something had been in here with me. The feeling of being watched returned, prickling my skin. My mind raced, thinking of the shadows I had seen. Had someone, no, something, been moving around in my room? I glanced over at the door. It was still closed, just as I had left it when I went to bed. The footsteps, though, didn't make sense. They weren't just random prints, they looked purposeful. Like someone had been pacing. Or worse, waiting. I turned slowly, scanning the room. The air felt thick, oppressive. I felt a strange compulsion to follow the trail of footprints. My feet moved on their own, as if drawn by an invisible force. The prints led to the door, but that was where they stopped. The trail didn't extend beyond it. I hesitated. My mind screamed at me to leave it alone, to not open the door. But I had to know. What if the answer lay just beyond that threshold? With a trembling hand, I gripped the doorknob and twisted. The door creaked open slowly, the sound sharp and unnervingly loud in the quiet house. I stood frozen, staring into the hallway beyond. It was empty, no signs of anyone or anything unusual. But something felt off. I could feel it in the air. A heaviness, like I wasn't alone. I stepped into the hallway cautiously, my breath shallow. The house seemed eerily silent. The faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen was the only sound that broke the silence. But as I walked, the hair on the back of my neck stood up. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see something, or someone, behind me. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating. I walked past the other rooms, checking each one, but found nothing out of the ordinary. The house felt too quiet, like it was holding its breath. It was then I noticed the window at the end of the hallway. It was open. It had been closed last night. I felt my pulse quicken as I approached it. The wind was light, but the air outside was colder than usual. I peered out, my eyes scanning the small backyard, but I saw nothing. Nothing except the shadows that stretched long across the lawn, reaching toward the house. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw a figure in the distance. Standing by the far side of the yard, just inside the tree line. My heart stopped. It was there, just as I had seen it last night. The same figure, standing perfectly still, watching me. I couldn't breathe. The figure didn't move, didn't even acknowledge me. It just stood there, shrouded in the darkness of the trees. My hand trembled as I slowly pulled back from the window. Something inside me told me I shouldn't have looked. The figure didn't belong outside, not in the way it stood there, not in the way it seemed to merge with the shadows. It was as if it had been waiting for me to notice. And now I knew that I had. The figure outside didn't move. It stood perfectly still, as though frozen in time, hidden by the shadows of the trees. My heart pounded in my chest, and my mind raced with terrifying thoughts. I took a step back from the window, my breath shallow, my hands cold. What was it? Who was it? The questions swirled in my mind, but none of them seemed to make sense. I couldn't see its face, couldn't make out any clear details. The figure was just there. And it felt wrong. It felt like it was watching me, waiting for something. I backed away from the window, my feet stumbling as I moved. I wanted to run, to get as far away as possible from this feeling, but I couldn't. My body felt rooted to the spot, paralyzed by the dread creeping up my spine. And then it happened. A sound, so faint I wasn't sure if I had imagined it, came from the hallway. A slow, deliberate creak. Like footsteps. I turned, my stomach churning. No one else was in the house. I had checked every room. The door was still shut, the hallway empty. But the sound had been so real, so clear. I pressed my back against the wall, barely daring to breathe, trying to listen for any sign of movement. The house felt like it was closing in on me. The walls felt too tight, the air too thick. Everything seemed off. I strained to listen. There it was again, footsteps. This time, they were closer. They were coming toward me. My pulse quickened, and I instinctively backed toward the door, my hand reaching out for the knob. I needed to get out of the house, away from whatever was happening. But just as I was about to turn the handle, I heard the unmistakable sound of a door opening. The footsteps stopped. I froze. My entire body tensed, and I swallowed hard. The house had become a maze in my mind. What if it wasn't just in my head? What if something or someone was really in here with me? The seconds felt like hours. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears. I wanted to scream, to call for help, but my throat was dry, my voice caught somewhere between fear and disbelief. I couldn't move. And then, a whisper, barely audible, drifted through the air. You shouldn't have looked. I whipped my head around, scanning the hallway. The whisper had come from nowhere. There was no one there. No movement, no sign of anyone. Just silence. But that voice, it was clear and chilling. It was as if someone had spoken directly into my ear. The words lingered in the air, heavy with menace. I spun around and bolted for the front door. My mind screamed at me to leave, to run as fast as I could, but my legs felt like lead. Each step felt heavier than the last, each breath more difficult to take. I reached for the door, my fingers trembling as they brushed against the cold metal handle. And then I froze. The door was locked. I never locked it. I hadn't touched it since I came inside. My hands fumbled with the knob, but it refused to turn. Panic surged through me. My mind raced, trying to find a way out, a way to escape whatever nightmare had unfolded around me. But the door remained stubbornly shut. I heard it again, the sound of slow footsteps. They were closer now, coming down the hallway toward me. I looked back, my eyes darting across the room. The figure outside the window was gone, but that didn't make me feel any better. If anything, it made the air feel colder, the silence even heavier. I had to escape. I had to get out before whatever was in the house found me. I turned away from the door and ran toward the back of the house. The footsteps followed, echoing through the empty halls. I didn't dare look behind me. I only had one thought in my mind, survival. As I reached the back door, I grabbed the handle, my hands slick with sweat. It turned easily, and the door creaked open, offering a sliver of freedom. I stepped outside, gulping in the cold air. But as I looked around the yard, I felt my blood run cold. The figure. It was back. Standing in the same spot as before, right outside the back door. This time, though, it wasn't motionless. It was moving, slowly, purposefully, its form becoming more distinct as it drew closer to me. I stumbled backward, my legs refusing to support me as I fell to the ground. My mind screamed for me to get up, to run, but my body wouldn't obey. The figure was closer now, so close I could almost make out its features. It was tall, unnaturally tall, with long limbs that seemed to stretch beyond human proportions. And then, the voice came again. You looked. Now you belong to me. I couldn't move. The words rang in my head like a haunting melody, their meaning sinking deep into my bones. I belonged to it. To that. Whatever it was, whatever had been waiting for me all this time. The figure drew closer, its long limbs swinging in the shadows, and my mind screamed at me to run. But my body betrayed me, rooted to the spot in terror. I was on the ground now, eyes wide in disbelief, watching as it stepped into the dim light of the yard. The figure was almost human, but not quite. The way it moved was wrong, like it didn't belong in the same space as the world around it. Its skin, pale and translucent, seemed to shimmer in the moonlight, an unnatural glow emanating from it. I tried to push myself up, but my limbs refused to cooperate, heavy with dread. My breath came in short, ragged bursts, and every instinct in my body screamed for me to get away, but my feet stayed frozen to the earth. The figure paused, its head tilting to the side, as if studying me. I could feel its eyes on me, even though I couldn't see them. There was nothing in the place where its eyes should have been, just darkness, a void that seemed to consume everything around it. My heart raced as its presence pressed down on me, suffocating me with its unnatural stillness. "Why did you look?" It spoke again, its voice a low rasp, vibrating through the air around me. It felt like the ground beneath me was shaking. The words were not just spoken, they were felt, like they reverberated in my very soul. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped my throat. I could barely breathe. Every second that passed, I felt more and more distant from myself, as though I was slipping away, becoming a part of the nightmare that surrounded me. The figure took a slow step forward, its feet dragging across the ground, and I finally managed to tear my eyes away. But it didn't matter. It was everywhere. The walls of my house, the trees in my yard, the very air around me, it all bent and twisted as if it were part of its world now. The figure had a presence, an undeniable force that was stretching and warping everything in its path. I forced myself to stand, my body trembling with the effort. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't let it get closer. There had to be an escape. I stumbled back, but the figure's voice echoed again, louder this time, as though it had crossed the gap between us and was now right behind me. "You saw what you weren't supposed to see," it whispered, and I felt a chill spread through my spine. "Now you can never forget." Panic surged through me, sharp and intense. I whirled around and bolted toward the gate at the edge of the yard, my legs pumping as fast as they could carry me. I could hear the figure behind me, its movements slow, almost leisurely, like it was toying with me. Every step I took toward the gate felt like it was taking me further from safety and deeper into whatever hell I had stumbled into. I reached the gate and slammed my hands against the cold metal, but it wouldn't budge. It was locked. It had always been locked. Desperation clawed at me as I pulled at the gate, my nails scraping against the metal. The figure was almost upon me now, its presence overwhelming, and I could feel it getting closer, closer than I had ever imagined anything could. I could almost feel its breath on the back of my neck, its fingers brushing my skin. Just as I thought it was over, a bright light flashed before my eyes. For a moment, I was blinded, disoriented. My senses were overwhelmed by the harsh brightness. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block out the pain. And then, as quickly as it had come, the light disappeared. I opened my eyes, blinking away the after-images, and found myself standing alone in the middle of the yard. The figure was gone. I stood there for a long moment, my chest heaving with exhaustion, my body still trembling from the terror that had overtaken me. Had it all been a hallucination? Had I imagined it? I looked around. Nothing. The night was still and quiet again, almost too quiet. But the unease in my gut remained, a gnawing feeling that something was still wrong. I turned back toward the house, moving cautiously, every muscle in my body alert. As I reached the door, I hesitated, my hand resting on the knob. What if it wasn't over? I pushed the door open and stepped inside, the familiar surroundings of my home now feeling foreign and threatening. I made my way to the hallway, my eyes scanning every shadow, every corner. It felt like I was walking in a dream, the house stretching and warping with every step I took. I could hear it again, the whisper, the voice. But this time, it wasn't just in my head. It was coming from somewhere deep inside the house. You can't run from me. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. The walls seemed to close in on me, the space narrowing as if it was squeezing the life out of me. The house was no longer my sanctuary, it had become part of the nightmare. And then I saw it. In the dim light of the hallway, a shadow moved. It was back. I could feel my breath quicken as the shadow in the hallway moved, stretching across the walls in unnatural ways. It was bigger now, its shape growing more defined with each passing second, like it was filling the very air of the house. My body was on autopilot, every instinct screaming at me to get out, but my feet refused to move. The sensation of being watched was overwhelming, suffocating. It wasn't just standing there anymore. It was coming closer, step by step, as though it was savoring my fear, taking its time. The faint sound of its footsteps echoed in the hall, louder with each advance, until they were the only noise that filled the space. Everything else, the rustling of the trees outside, the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, even my own heartbeat, seemed to fade away, drowned by the ominous sound of its approach. I stumbled backward, my eyes locked on the darkness in front of me. The figure moved fluidly, like it was part of the shadows themselves, no longer constrained by the space or time that should have kept it in check. And then, it spoke again, its voice piercing the silence like a dagger to the chest. You shouldn't have come back. My legs buckled beneath me, and I collapsed to the floor, gasping for air. I felt like I was suffocating, like the very walls of the house were closing in on me. I couldn't look away, couldn't tear my eyes from the figure that loomed over me. The darkness was thickening around it, suffocating me, as if it were pulling me into its own dimension, one where light and air no longer existed. You saw it. You looked, the voice hissed. Now, you belong to it. I tried to scream, but nothing came out. My throat felt dry, like it was closing up, suffocated by the weight of its presence. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't move. The shadow stretched its hand toward me, its fingers long and elongated, its shape more monstrous than anything I had ever seen. It reached for me slowly, deliberately, like it had all the time in the world. I closed my eyes, not wanting to see the end. But then, something inside me snapped. A desperate force surged through me, and my legs moved, without thought, without hesitation. I pushed myself to my feet, stumbling down the hall, away from the dark shape that had haunted me for so long. I didn't know where I was going. All I knew was that I had to get away. I had to escape. My fingers fumbled with the door handle as I reached the front door, my mind spinning with fear. I pushed it open with all my strength, the cool night air hitting me like a slap in the face. I didn't stop to look back. I ran. The yard was quiet now, too quiet, as if the world had fallen silent. The wind no longer rustled through the trees, and the chirping of insects had ceased. Everything was still, too still, like the world was holding its breath. I ran toward the fence, my legs screaming in protest, but I didn't care. I had to get away. But just as I reached the fence, a cold hand gripped my shoulder, and I froze. The figure was standing behind me, its presence as tangible as the night itself. I could feel its breath on the back of my neck, its fingers digging into my skin, cold as ice. "You can't escape," it whispered. "You belong to me now." I turned around, my body trembling with fear, but I didn't see the figure anymore. There was nothing behind me but the empty space, the stillness of the yard. I blinked, unsure if my mind was playing tricks on me. I looked around, nothing. No figure, no shadow. But I knew it was still there. I could feel it. The fear was all-consuming now, gnawing at me from the inside out. My pulse pounded in my ears, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I couldn't run anymore. I had nowhere to go. I stumbled back toward the house, trying to get some sense of control. But the world around me felt like it was slipping away. The walls were closing in. The air was thick with a presence that I couldn't see, but I knew was there, lurking in the corners of my vision, just out of reach. I slammed the door shut behind me and locked it. I leaned against it, breathless, eyes darting around the room, searching for the slightest sign of the figure. The house felt different now, like it wasn't my own anymore. The shadows seemed deeper, the air heavier. I could still hear the whispering, but it was no longer just in my mind. It was coming from somewhere inside the house. "You shouldn't have come back." I spun around. The voice was louder now, closer. I could almost feel the figure's presence in the very walls of the house, as if it had taken over everything. My pulse raced. I couldn't keep running. I couldn't keep hiding. I was never supposed to see it. Never supposed to know. But I had. And now, it was too late. The darkness had taken me. It had always been there, waiting, watching. And now, there was no escaping it. Hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.